Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There is a question that echoes through the oldest corridors of galactic history, a question whispered among the dying stars and encoded within ruins so ancient that even the light of their suns has long since faded into memory. What destroyed the old ones? Not merely what killed them, because death implies a single moment, a clean severance between existence and oblivion. What happened to the old ones was far worse than death. It was a slow unraveling, a catastrophe that arrived from every direction at once, born equally from their enemies' hatred and from the unintended consequences of their own desperate genius. To understand their destruction is to understand the foundation upon which the entire grim darkness of the far future was built. Because every war fought in the 41st millennium, every demon that claws its way through the veil of reality, every silent tomb world humming beneath barren soil, all of it traces its origins back to the moment when the oldest and wisest civilization the galaxy had ever known was brought to its knees and scattered into extinction. So, settle in. Let the noise of the day fall away for a while. This is the story of the very first apocalypse, the one that came before all others, and its shadow stretches across 60 million years to touch every living thing that draws breath beneath alien stars. We are going to take our time with this one, walking through every stage of the Old One's fall, from the first stirrings of the jealousy that would ignite the galaxy's greatest war, to the final devastating plague that snuffed out the oldest civilization in existence. Along the way, we will discover that the destruction of the Old Ones was not a simple story of one enemy defeating another, but a cascading failure of cosmic proportions, where every attempted solution created new problems worse than the ones it was meant to solve, and where the seeds of annihilation were planted not by villains, but by the desperate hands of beings who were only trying to survive. Let us begin at the beginning, or as close to the beginning as we can get, because the true beginning of this story predates recorded history by so many millions of years that even the concept of time begins to lose its meaning. Before we can understand what destroyed the Old Ones, we first have to grapple with something almost impossible to fully comprehend, which is who they actually were and what they meant to the galaxy. While the sources we have are fragmentary at best, scattered across a dozen different civilizations and filtered through 60 million years of distortion, myth-making, and deliberate obfuscation. The Eldari remember them as the first ones, ancient figures of shadow and light who descended from the heavens in vessels that were worn and scarred by an unending war. In the oldest Eldari texts, the first ones are described as beings older than gods, yet still mortal, subject to the passage of time, even if that passage was measured across timescales that would make the lifespan of a star seem brief. The Necrons remember them with a hatred so intense that it has survived 60 million years of dormancy, burning just as fiercely in the minds of newly awakened Tomb Lords as it did in the hearts of the Necron-Tyre warriors who first went to war against them. The Orcs, in their own crude and characteristically blunt way, recall the Old Ones as the Brain Boys, beings of vast intelligence who created the greenskin species and then vanished before the job was finished, leaving their children to stumble through the galaxy without guidance or purpose. And scattered across countless worlds, buried beneath layers of sediment older than most mountain ranges, there are ruins and artifacts that hint at a civilization so advanced that its science was indistinguishable from what lesser species would call sorcery. What we can piece together from these scattered fragments paints a picture of something extraordinary, something that the galaxy has never seen before or since. The Old Ones were among the first sentient species to arise in the Milky Way, possibly the very first to achieve true sapience and to look up at the stars with understanding rather than mere animal wonder. Their emergence occurred so long ago that the galaxy itself was still young, its spiral arms still settling into the elegant curves that define their shape in the present age. Stars that are now ancient red giants swollen and dying, their nuclear fuel nearly spent, were young and blue-white when the old ones first opened their eyes and began their patient study of the universe. The sheer depth of time we are talking about is almost impossible for a mortal mind to grasp. 60 million years. If you compress the entire span of recorded human history into a single second, that the age of the Old One's civilization would stretch back for hours. They existed for longer than most geological features. Mountains rose and eroded to dust in the time they walked among the stars. Continents drifted across the faces of their worlds, collided, broke apart, and reformed in entirely new configurations, while the old ones continued their slow, patient work. They were a cold-blooded species, both literally and figuratively. Reptilian in nature, if the fragmentary descriptions and ancient carvings found on Aeldari exodite worlds are to be believed, with a temperament to match. They did not rush. They did not act on impulse. They observed, and they studied, and they thought, and when they finally chose to act, they did so with a deliberation that spoke of minds accustomed to thinking in millennia rather than decades, is in geological epochs rather than generations. Their patience was not the patience of a predator waiting to strike. It was the patience of a gardener who plants an acorn and knows that the oak tree growing from it will not reach its full majesty for centuries, and who is perfectly content to wait. Their first great achievement was not a weapon or a conquest, but an understanding. They studied the stars with a methodical precision that elevated astronomy and astrophysics into something approaching a spiritual practice. Night after night, generation after generation, millennium after millennium, they mapped the heavens and catalogued the forces that shaped them. They traced the life cycles of stars from their violent births in collapsing nebulae to their slow deaths as red giants or their spectacular ends as supernovae. And they measured the distances between galaxies and pondered the rate at which the universe itself was expanding. And through those studies, through that patient and painstaking examination of the fundamental structure of reality itself, they made a discovery that would change the course of galactic history forever. They discovered the Imperium. Now, in the 41st millennium, the Imperium is known by a simpler and far more terrifying name: the Warp. It is a roiling ocean of psychic energy, a dimension of nightmares given form, where the thoughts and emotions of living beings are reflected and amplified into entities of terrible power. Demons prowl its depths, hunting for souls to devour. The laughter of thirsting gods echoes through its impossible geometries, each one a sentient vortex of malice and hunger, sustained by the suffering of mortal beings. To enter the warp unprotected is to invite madness, corruption, and a death that is merely the beginning of an eternity of torment. The Imperium of man treats it as a necessary evil, a dangerous highway that must be navigated because no alternative exists. The Aeldari treat it with a mixture of reverence and terror, knowing that it harbors the god that was born from their own excess. And everyone, without exception, fears it. But it was not always this way. This is one of the most important things to understand about the story we are telling, because it reframes everything that came after. When the Old Ones first reached out and touched the Imperium with their minds, it was a vast ocean of psychic energy. It was a vast ocean of psychic energy, yes, but that energy was gentle, nearly peaceful, like the surface of an enormous lake on a windless morning, its waters so still that they reflected the stars above with perfect clarity. There were no storms raging through its depths, no predatory entities lurking in its shadows, no malevolent intelligences scheming and plotting and reaching out with clawed hands to drag unwary travelers into oblivion. The Imperium in those primordial days was not a realm of horror, but a realm of potential, an infinite reservoir of psychic energy that existed alongside the material universe in a state of perfect an undisturbed equilibrium. There were entities within it, to be sure. Even in those earliest days, the Imperium was not entirely empty, but its inhabitants were innocuous things, wisps of psychic potential drifting through a formless expanse without malice or direction, or any quality that could be described as intent. Think of them as the psychic equivalent of plankton floating in a primordial ocean, tiny, simple, and essentially harmless. They had no appetites to satisfy, no agendas to pursue, no capacity for the kind of focused, purposeful evil that would later characterize the warp's most notorious denizens. They simply existed, passive and purposeless, in a dimension that was as tranquil as the material universe was turbulent. The Old Ones, now with their patient genius and their deep understanding of the fundamental forces that governed both dimensions, learned to harness the potential of the Imperium in ways that defy easy description even now, 60 million years later. They developed what can only be called psychic engineering, the ability to manipulate the energies of the warp with the same precision and reliability that lesser civilizations would later apply to the manipulation of steel and stone and silicon. Where a human engineer might shape raw materials into a bridge or a building, the Old Ones shaped psychic energy into structures and tools and devices of staggering complexity and power. And their greatest achievement, the crowning jewel of their mastery over the space between spaces, was the webway. Imagine a network of tunnels threaded through the very fabric of the Imperium itself, not carved through it in the crude sense of physical excavation, but woven into its structure, constructed from the very substance of the warp, and yet sealed against its energies by wards and barriers of psychic power, so sophisticated that they have endured for 60 million years without significant degradation. Each tunnel connected to specific points in the material universe through portals that the Old Ones could open and close at will, and the tunnels themselves allowed instantaneous transit between these points, regardless of the physical distance separating them. Step through a portal on one world, and you could emerge a heartbeat later on a planet halfway across the galaxy. No long, dangerous voyages through the open warp. No vulnerability to the currents and entities that inhabited the Imperium. Just clean, safe, instantaneous travel across distances that light itself would take millennia to cross. The strategic implications of this technology were staggering. Communication across galactic distances was instantaneous. Resources could be moved from any world to any other world without delay. Military forces could be deployed anywhere in the galaxy the moment they were needed, arriving fresh, organized, and ready for combat. Economic activity could flow freely between planets, separated by vast gulfs of space, as easily as between neighboring cities on the same continent. The webway was the backbone of an interstellar civilization that spanned the entire Milky Way, and its existence gave the Old Ones an advantage so absolute, so fundamental, as that no other species in the galaxy could hope to challenge their supremacy. But the Old Ones were not conquerors. They were not empire builders in the way that human civilizations understand the term. They did not seek to dominate or subjugate or exploit the worlds they visited. They were, for lack of a better word, gardeners, nurturers, cultivators of the great garden of life that they saw the galaxy as being. In a galaxy that was still young and largely empty of intelligent life, the Old Ones took it upon themselves to fill that emptiness with the sounds of living things. They traveled from world to world through their webway, seeding planets with new forms of life, encouraging the development of indigenous species, guiding the evolutionary paths of promising organisms toward intelligence and self-awareness with a gentle but firm hand. They terraformed barren rocks into lush paradises, adjusting atmospheres and hydrospheres and climates with the casual precision of a homeowner rearranging furniture. They manipulated genetic codes with a skill that modern Magos biologies of the Adeptus Mechanicus could only dream of, accelerating the development of species that showed potential and correcting the dead ends and inefficiencies that natural evolution inevitably produces. The scope of this undertaking beggars the imagination. We are talking about a species that treated entire planets as canvases, that approached the development of biological life the way a master painter approaches a masterwork that will take a lifetime to complete. Except the Old One's lifetime was measured in millions of years, and their canvas was the entire galaxy. They did not simply create life. One would eventually arise. Often millions would eventually arise, often millions of years after the Old Ones had moved on to other projects. They understood the relationship between biology and consciousness at a level so deep that they could predict, with reasonable accuracy, what a species might become in a million years based on the genetic templates they had established for it. They believed, it seems, that all life was useful, that every new species represented a new perspective on the universe, a new way of seeing and understanding and experiencing the staggering grandeur of existence. And so they spread life wherever they went, nurturing it with the care of parents tending to their children. Yet the fragmentary records suggest was closer to the truth than the official version. It was a story of survival and resilience, of a people who refused to be defined by their circumstances. It was a story of hope and possibility, of a world that was not yet fully realized. It was a story of the human spirit, of the power of the human mind to create and to endure. It was a story of the power of the human spirit to create and to endure. It was a story of the power of the human spirit to create and to endure. It was a story of the power of the human spirit to create and to endure. It was a story of the power of the human spirit to create and to endure. It was a story of the power of the human spirit to create and to endure. It was a story of the power of the human spirit to create and to endure. It was a story of the power of the human spirit to create and to endure. It was a story of the power of the human spirit to create and to endure. It was a story of the power of the human spirit to create and to endure. It was a story of the power of the human spirit to create and to endure. It was a story of the power of the human spirit to create and to endure. It was a story of the power of the human spirit to create and to endure. It was a story of the power of the human spirit to create and to endure. It was a story of the power of the human spirit to create and to endure. It was a story of the power of the human spirit to create and to endure. It was a story of the power of the human spirit to create and to endure. It was a story of the power of the human spirit to create and to endure. It was a story of the power of the human spirit to create and to endure. It was a story of the power of the human spirit to create and to endure. It was a story of the power of the human spirit to create and to endure. It was a story of the power of the human spirit to create and to endure. It was a story of the power of the human spirit to create and to endure. It was a story of the power of the human spirit to create and to endure. It was a story of the power of the human spirit to create and to endure. It was a story of the power of the human spirit to create and to endure. It was a story of the power of the human spirit to create and to endure. It was a story of the power of the human spirit to create and to endure. It was a story of the power of the human spirit to create and to endure. It was a story of the power of the human spirit to create and to endure. It was a story of the power of the human spirit to create and to endure. It was a story of the power of the fragmentary records suggest was closer to love, or at least to a deep and abiding commitment to the principle that consciousness, in all its diverse and unpredictable forms, was the most precious thing in the universe. It is important to hold this image in your mind as we move forward through this story. The Old Ones at their peak were not warriors. They were not conquerors. They were the closest thing the galaxy has ever had to benevolent gods, vast in their power, patient in their wisdom, and genuinely devoted to the flourishing of the younger species they had helped bring into existence. They had mastered the fundamental forces of reality, Or they could cross the galaxy in a single step. They could reshape worlds and create entire species with the precision of artists working in a medium they had spent millions of years perfecting. They had achieved something that no civilization before or since has managed to replicate. A stable, peaceful, galaxy-spanning order maintained not by force of arms, but by the sheer depth of their understanding of how the universe worked. And they had been doing this for so long, across such immense stretches of time, that they had almost certainly come to believe that their reign would last forever, that nothing could threaten them, that the order they had imposed upon the galaxy was as permanent and unshakable as the laws of physics themselves. And to truly grasp the magnitude of what was lost, but we need to spend a little more time dwelling in the world the Old Ones built, because it is only by understanding how extraordinary their civilization was that we can appreciate just how devastating its destruction would prove to be. Think of the webway not as a single highway, but as something more like a circulatory system, a living network of tunnels and passages of wildly varying sizes and purposes. Some of these passages were narrow corridors, barely wide enough for a single being to walk through, connecting minor outposts or isolated research stations to the broader network. Others were vast arterial highways, tunnels so enormous that entire fleets of ships could pass through them abreast, their walls shimmering with the psychic wards that protected travelers from the ambient energies of the Imperium through which the tunnels ran. And at the great nexus points where multiple tunnels converged, there were spaces so large and so complex that they constituted pocket dimensions in their own right, vast chambers and plazas and structures that existed entirely within the webway, connected to the material universe only through the carefully maintained gates that served as entry and exit points. The construction of the webway must have been an undertaking that lasted millions of years. Each tunnel had to be individually woven from the substance of the immaterium, its walls reinforced with psychic wards of such complexity that even the Ildari, who would later inherit the webway and study its construction for millennia, never fully understood how they worked. The gates that connected the webway to the material universe had to be carefully calibrated to specific locations, anchored to the very fabric of reality, with bonds that could withstand the constant pressure of the warp trying to seep through. And the whole system had to be maintained, constantly monitored and repaired and adjusted to account for the natural fluctuations of the immaterium, which even in its calm, pre-corruption state was not entirely static. It was, in every meaningful sense, the greatest engineering project in the history of the galaxy, greater than any fortress or fleet or weapon system, greater than the terraforming of worlds or the creation of entire species. The webway was the backbone of a galactic civilization, the nervous system of an empire that spanned the entire Milky Way, and without it, the Old One's dominion would have been impossible to establish, impossible to maintain, and impossible to defend. And the Old Ones used this incredible tool not primarily for war or conquest, but for something far more remarkable. They used it to garden. Consider what it means to seed life across an entire galaxy. We are not talking about scattering a few organisms on a handful of convenient planets. We are talking about a systematic, galaxy-spanning program of biological creation and management that touched millions of worlds across hundreds of thousands of light years. On each of these worlds, the Old Ones would have had to assess the local conditions, the chemical composition of the atmosphere, the intensity and spectrum of the local star's radiation, the geological activity of the planet's surface, the presence or absence of water, and the dozens of other factors that determine whether a world can support life. And then they would have had to design organisms specifically adapted to those conditions, creating entire ecosystems from scratch, establishing food chains and nutrient cycles and reproductive strategies that would allow their creations to survive and thrive without constant intervention. The patience this required is almost inconceivable. A single ecosystem on a single world might take millions of years to develop from initial seeding to a stable, self-sustaining state. The evolution of intelligent life from simple organisms was a process that, even with the Old One's guidance, could not be rushed beyond certain fundamental biological limits. And the Old Ones were running this process simultaneously on millions of worlds across the entire breadth of the galaxy, managing each one with the attention to detail that a master gardener devotes to a single prize plant. What drove them to do this is something we can only speculate about, since the Old Ones left no philosophical treatises or religious texts that have survived to the present day. Perhaps they believed that life was inherently valuable, that consciousness was a good in itself, that ought to be maximized wherever conditions permitted. Perhaps they saw the seeding of the galaxy as their purpose, the reason they existed, a cosmic mandate that they had either received from some higher authority or assigned to themselves through their own philosophical reasoning. Perhaps it was simply in their nature, just as it is in the nature of a tree to produce seeds, so it was in the nature of the Old Ones to produce life. And they pursued this imperative with the same unconscious dedication that a plant devotes to growing toward the light. Whatever the reason, the result was a galaxy that was alive in a way that it had never been before, and arguably has never been since. Not just alive in the sense of biological organisms existing on scattered worlds, but alive in the sense of a connected, curated, purposefully designed collection of ecosystems and civilizations that were meant to complement and support each other. The Old Ones were not creating life at random. They were building something, a structure, a pattern, a design that we cannot fully perceive because we can only see tiny fragments of it, scattered and damaged and separated from their context by 60 million years of subsequent history. Some scholars have speculated that the Old Ones were working toward a specific goal, that the seeding of the galaxy with intelligent life was not an end in itself, but a means to some greater purpose that we cannot comprehend. Perhaps they were trying to create a galaxy-wide psychic network, a web of interconnected consciousnesses that could channel and direct the energies of the Imperium in ways that no single species could achieve alone. Perhaps they were preparing for some future crisis that their ancient wisdom allowed them to foresee, building the foundations of a defense that would only become necessary millions of years in the future. Or perhaps, and this is the most unsettling possibility, they were following instructions, executing a plan that had been laid down by some intelligence, even older and more powerful than themselves, or say a plan whose full scope and purpose remains entirely unknown. We will never know for certain. The Old Ones took their secrets with them when they fell, and the galaxy they left behind has been too busy fighting for its survival to spare much thought for the motivations of beings who died before the dinosaurs walked the earth. But the legacy of their work endures in every living thing that draws breath beneath an alien sun, in every species that owes its existence, directly or indirectly, to the patient, deliberate, unfathomably long-term project of galactic cultivation that the Old Ones pursued for longer than most geological features have existed. And it was this legacy, this extraordinary achievement of creation and nurturing and patient cultivation, as that was threatened when the Necrontyr came calling with hatred in their hearts and demands on their lips. The Old Ones looked at the species that was asking them to share the secret of immortality and saw, perhaps, a threat to everything they had built. Not because the Necrontyr were powerful, they were not yet, but because the Necrontyr were angry, and angry species have a tendency to break things, and the Old Ones had spent millions of years building things that were very, very fragile. The irony, of course, is that by refusing the Necrontyr's request, the Old Ones created exactly the situation they were presumably trying to avoid. By declining to share their knowledge, they ensured that the Necrontyr's anger would grow rather than diminish, that their frustration would curdle into hatred, and that their hatred would eventually drive them to seek allies powerful enough to threaten not just the Old Ones themselves, but the entire galactic order that the Old Ones had spent so long establishing. It is one of the oldest stories in the universe, a decision made from a position of strength that fails to account for the desperation of those it affects, a refusal that seems reasonable even wise, in the moment, but plants the seeds of a catastrophe that will bloom in its own time, in its own way, with consequences that no one could have predicted. They were wrong. And the first crack in the foundation of their eternal empire appeared in the form of a species that could not have been more different from them. A species born not in the gentle light of a nurturing sun, but in the harsh, killing glare of a star that seemed to hate the very life it had spawned. Picture a world bathed in the hateful light of a dying star, not the warm golden glow of a healthy sun, the kind of light that invites you to sit beneath a tree and feel the warmth soaking into your skin. This was something else entirely, a harsh, sickly radiance that bombarded every surface with hard ionizing radiation, that stripped away cellular integrity with every passing moment, that turned the simple act of existing into a slow and unrelenting form of torture. The sky above this world would not have been blue or green or any of the colors we associate with worlds that welcome life. It would have been a washed-out, searing white, the color of a star that was burning too hot and too fast, hemorrhaging energy with a recklessness that betrayed its approaching death. This was the homeworld of the Necrontyre, and the star that hung above them was not a source of life, but a sentence of death, a cosmic curse written in ultraviolet and gamma rays that condemned every member of their species to a life that was brutally, mercilessly short. Think about what it must have been like to grow up under such conditions. From the moment of your birth, your cells are under assault. Your DNA is accumulating damage faster than your body's repair mechanisms can possibly keep up with. Cancers bloom in your flesh like dark flowers after a poisonous rain, sprouting in your lungs, your liver, your brain, your bones, growing with a speed and aggression that mirrors the malevolence of the star that caused them. Your joints ache with a deep, grinding pain that never fully goes away. Your skin develops lesions and sores that weep and refuse to heal. And you know with a certainty that is as much a part of your existence as breathing, that your life will be short. Not short in the way that a human life might seem short compared to the lifespan of a star. Short in the way that a candle flame is short. A brief, painful flicker in the darkness, snuffed out almost before it has time to fully catch. A few decades of life, if you were fortunate. Perhaps as little as a single decade, if you were not. That was the birthright of every Necrontyre, the inheritance passed down from parent to child across uncounted generations. And during those few agonizing years, you were expected to learn, to work, to contribute to a civilization, to build something of lasting value, as all while your body slowly fell apart around you like a structure built on soil that was constantly, unstoppably eroding. The Necrontyre were not a primitive people. Let us be very clear about that, because the tragedy of their story depends on understanding that they were not savages stumbling through the dark, but a sophisticated, intelligent, technologically advanced civilization that had achieved remarkable things despite the horrific disadvantage of their biology. They had developed space travel, though their methods were slow and conventional compared to the old one's instantaneous webway transit. They had established colonies across multiple star systems, reaching out from their poisoned homeworld with a determination that bordered on the heroic, planting flags on distant planets in the hope that their children might live better lives under different stars. They had developed art, philosophy, science, engineering. They had built cities and universities and hospitals and all the other institutions that mark a species as having risen above mere animal survival into something approaching civilization. But no matter how far they spread, no matter how advanced their technology became, they could not escape the fundamental curse of their genetics. The radiation damage accumulated over millennia of living under their baleful sun was woven too deeply into their species' DNA to be extracted by any means the Necrontyre could devise. Even on worlds with healthy, nurturing stars, the Necrontyre still sickened and died far sooner than any species should. The damage was inheritable, as self-perpetuating, a legacy of suffering that passed from generation to generation like a debt that could never be repaid. Their culture reflected this grim reality in every aspect. Their art was obsessed with themes of death, decay, and the transience of all things. Their philosophy was fatalistic, circling endlessly around the question of what meaning could be found in an existence so brief and so painful. Their architecture favored tombs and memorial structures over palaces and pleasure gardens. Because what was the point of building something beautiful when you would not live long enough to enjoy it? Even their language, according to the fragmentary accounts that survive, was structured around concepts of loss and impermanence, with a vocabulary for different types of grief that was reportedly richer and more nuanced than the vocabularies most species develop for describing color or sound. And their politics was poisoned by the same nihilism that infected everything else. The Necrontyr Empire was divided into numerous dynasties, each ruled by a pharaoh, each with its own territories, its own traditions, its own grievances. These dynasties did not coexist peacefully. They fought, constantly, viciously, with a bitterness and a fury that seemed to draw fuel from the brevity of the lives being spent in its pursuit. Why negotiate when you would be dead before the negotiations concluded? Why compromise when the person you were compromising with would be dust before the ink on the agreement had dried? The wars of secession, as these internal conflicts came to be called, were tearing the Necrontyr Empire apart, and by the time the species encountered the Old Ones, their civilization was already teetering on the edge of collapse. And then they learned about the Old Ones. Imagine what that discovery must have felt like. You are a member of a species that has never known anything but suffering, a people for whom death is not a distant possibility, but an ever-present companion breathing down your neck from the moment you first open your eyes. And then you learn that somewhere out there, somewhere beyond the light of your poisoned sun, there exists a race of beings who live for thousands upon thousands of years. Beings who move through the stars as easily as you walk through a doorway, stepping from one world to the next through portals that fold the very fabric of space. Beings who have had so much time to grow and learn and create that their civilization makes yours look like a sandcastle built on a beach, waiting for the tide. They have everything you have ever wanted, the time to think long thoughts, to build things that will endure, to love someone without the constant, gnawing knowledge that you will lose them before you can fully understand what they mean to you. They have bodies that do not betray them, that do not fill with tumors and break down into uselessness before they have even reached the halfway point of what any reasonable species would consider a natural lifespan. They have a serenity, a calm, as a patience that comes from knowing that they have all the time in the universe to accomplish whatever they desire, and they do not seem inclined to share any of it. The Necrontyr petitioned the Old Ones for the secret of their near-immortal lifespans. It was the most natural request imaginable, a dying species reaching out to an ancient one and asking for the medicine that would make the pain stop. A child tugging at the sleeve of a passing adult and asking, "Please, can you help me? I am hurting and I do not know how to make it stop." And the Old Ones said no. The reasons for the refusal are lost to time, buried under 60 million years of myth and counter-myth, and the distortions introduced by every species that has retold the story since. Perhaps the Old Ones had genuine reasons for withholding the secret of their longevity. Yes, perhaps they understood that immortality was not a gift that could be casually bestowed upon another species without fundamentally altering the recipient in ways that might be dangerous. Perhaps they looked at the Necrontyr, with their wars and their violence and their bitter, nihilistic culture, and judged them unready for the responsibilities that came with an indefinite lifespan. Perhaps they were simply cautious, unwilling to trust their most intimate secrets to a species they did not fully understand. Or perhaps, and this is the interpretation that the Necrontyr arrived at with a speed and a conviction that suggests it had been lurking in their hearts all along, the Old Ones simply did not care. as perhaps their supposed benevolence was nothing more than a comfortable lie they told themselves to justify their dominion over a galaxy they treated as their personal garden.
I want to take a quick pause here because this is honestly one of the things that keeps me coming back to this setting. The old ones are barely a footnote in most 40k discussions, right? People talk about the Horus Heresy, the Emperor, the Primarchs, but nobody really sits with the fact that everything, and I mean everything in this universe, traces back to a species we know almost nothing about. That haunts me a little bit. We have more lore about a single Space Marine chapter than we do about the civilization that literally shaped the galaxy, and I think Games Workshop does that on purpose. The mystery is the point. The less we know, the bigger they feel, but personally, I hope we get more someday. Even just a short story from their perspective during those final days would be incredible. But anyways, that's just my take. Let's get back to the video.
Perhaps the ancient gardeners viewed the Necrontyr the way a gardener views a weed, with indifference at best, and with mild irritation at worst. Whatever the truth, the effect was devastating. The refusal struck the Necrontyr like a physical blow, a rejection that seemed to confirm every dark suspicion they had ever harbored about a universe that appeared designed to maximize their suffering. The Old Ones had the power to end their agony, and chose not to. The Old Ones could see them dying by the millions, generation after generation, and felt no compulsion to help. The Old Ones, in the Necrontyr's eyes, were not benevolent gods, but indifferent ones. And there is no hatred in the galaxy more bitter than the hatred a suffering creature feels for a powerful being that could ease its pain, but chooses not to. That hatred became the defining characteristic of Necrontyr civilization. It permeated every aspect of their culture, coloring their art with new and darker hues, twisting their philosophy from mere fatalism into something closer to active nihilism, poisoning their already toxic politics with a new and virulent strain of paranoid resentment. Where once the Necrontyr had merely been angry at the universe for the injustice of their condition, now they had a specific target for that anger, a face to put on the cosmic indifference that had tormented them since their species' first conscious thought. Or the Old Ones became the embodiment of everything the Necrontyr hated about their existence, and the desire to destroy them, to tear down their ancient civilization and feast upon the ruins, became the central obsession of an entire species. The Triarch, the ruling council of the Necrontyr Empire, recognized this obsession for what it was: an opportunity. The wars of secession were destroying them from within. The dynasties were at each other's throats. Resources that should have been spent on survival were being squandered on internal conflicts that benefited no one. What the Triarch needed was something to unify the Necrontyr, something powerful enough to make the feuding dynasties set aside their grievances and fight together against a common enemy. And the Old Ones, and with their maddening longevity and their effortless superiority and their callous refusal to share the one thing the Necrontyr wanted more than anything else in the universe, were the perfect target. The Silent King declared war. The Old Ones' refusal to share the secret of immortality served as the official justification, and the promise of spoils and stolen secrets served as the incentive. Secessionist dynasties were offered amnesty in exchange for returning to the fold and contributing their forces to the Great Crusade. And it worked. The fractured, infighting Necrontyr Empire pulled itself together with a speed and a unity that would have been impressive under any circumstances, and was downright miraculous given the depth of the divisions that had previously characterized their politics. For the first time in their recorded history, the Necrontyr were one people, united by a hatred so consuming that it burned away every other concern. Their fleets surged outward from the Halo stars, where they had established their outermost colonies, weapons blazing, soldiers filled with a ferocious determination that can only come from beings who believe they have nothing to lose. They were going to war against the masters of the galaxy, against a civilization that had existed for millions of years longer than their own, against enemies who could cross the galaxy in a single step and whose technology was so far advanced beyond their own that it might as well have been actual magic. It was, to put it bluntly, a catastrophe. The Necrontyr had numbers. They had technology. They had the burning fuel of righteous fury driving them forward, but they did not have the webway. And then that single disadvantage proved to be absolutely, totally, insurmountably fatal to every strategic and tactical plan they devised. The Old Ones could move their forces instantaneously. The Necrontyre could not. That gap in capability made every other advantage the Necrontyre possessed irrelevant. It did not matter how many ships they had, if those ships could not reach the battle in time. It did not matter how advanced their weapons were, if the Old Ones could simply step through a portal and appear behind them. It did not matter how fiercely their soldiers fought if the enemy could choose when and where every engagement took place, always fighting on ground of their own choosing, always arriving with the perfect combination of forces to counter whatever the Necrontyre had deployed. Every Necrontyre offensive was met with a perfectly calibrated response. Every advance was flanked. Every concentration of force was either met head-on by an equal force that appeared from nowhere or simply bypassed, with the Old Ones striking at the staging areas and supply depots that the Necrontyre had left undefended in order to mass their strength for the attack. It was like trying to fight smoke. The moment you closed your fist around it, it dissipated and reformed somewhere else. And while you were reaching for it, something hit you from behind. The wars that followed were terrible in their one-sidedness. The Necrontyre threw everything they had at the Old Ones and were beaten back again and again and again. Their fleets were shattered. Their colonies were overrun. While their greatest generals were outmaneuvered by opponents who seemed to know their every move before they made it. And through it all, the Old Ones treated the entire conflict with what must have appeared, to the Necrontyre, as contemptuous nonchalance. This was not a war to the Old Ones. This was pest control. The Necrontyre were an irritation, nothing more. A younger species throwing a tantrum that would eventually burn itself out. And eventually, it did. The Necrontyre were pushed back to the outermost edges of the galaxy, exiled to the cold emptiness of the halo stars. Their empire diminished, their military shattered, their brief moment of unity already beginning to fracture as the old rivalries and resentments reasserted themselves in the absence of a unifying victory. The wars of secession resumed, more bitter than ever, now compounded by the shame of defeat. The Necrontyre were right back where they had started, only worse, because now they had tasted the humiliation of being swatted aside by an enemy that barely seemed to notice them. The Old Ones, for their part, returned to their great works without a backward glance. The Necrontyre episode was, in all likelihood, a footnote in their vast and ancient records, a minor disturbance dealt with and forgotten. They had more important things to concern themselves with: worlds to seed, species to nurture, the great garden of galactic life to tend and expand and protect. But in the frozen darkness of the halo stars, something was changing. Something that the Old Ones, for all their ancient wisdom, had failed to anticipate. The Necrontyre had not given up. Their hatred had not cooled with defeat. If anything, what it had intensified, concentrated, refined itself into something purer and more dangerous than it had been before the war. And in their desperate search for some power, some weapon, some advantage that could tip the scales, the Necrontyre turned their attention to something they had always studied but never fully understood: their sun, the star that had cursed them since the dawn of their species, that had poisoned their bodies and shortened their lives and filled their culture with a fatalistic obsession with death, turned out to be harboring a secret. Because the Necrontyre's star, for all its malevolence, was home to something far older and far more powerful than mere radiation. Something that had existed since the first moments of creation, feeding on the raw electromagnetic energy of stellar fusion, drifting through the plasma currents of the star's interior like a vast, diffuse intelligence, dreaming dreams that no mortal mind could even begin to comprehend. The Necrontyre had discovered the Satan, the star gods, the oldest entities in existence, born at the same moment as the universe itself, formed from the primal energies that erupted during the instant of creation. They had come into being when the first stars were still igniting, when the fundamental forces of physics were still settling into their final configurations, when the universe was nothing more than hot hydrogen gas and light elemental dust ruled by the gravitational pull of billions of newborn suns. They were energy beings of almost incomprehensible scale, their consciousness spread across areas larger than whole planets, while their existence measured not in millions of years, but in billions, stretching all the way back to the very beginning of everything. But the Satan had never taken physical form. They had never walked upon a planet's surface, never spoken to a mortal being, never participated in the affairs of the material universe in any way that the species living within it could perceive. They existed as patterns in the plasma of stars, feeding on electromagnetic radiation, the way biological organisms feed on chemical energy, and they were content with this existence. Why would they not be? Their stars provided everything they needed. They had no ambitions, no grievances, no desires beyond the continuation of their own timeless drifting existence. And here was the crucial detail, the fact upon which the entire subsequent history of the galaxy would pivot like a door turning on its hinge. The Satan had no connection whatsoever to the Imperium. They were beings of pure material reality, creatures of matter and energy and the physical laws that governed the universe. The warp was as alien and irrelevant to them as the bottom of an ocean trench is to a bird flying through the sky. They could not sense it, they could not manipulate it, they could not be affected by it, which meant that the Old One's entire arsenal, every weapon, every defense, every technology, every advantage that their civilization was built upon, was useless against them. The Necrontyr had found their weapon. Now they just needed to convince it to help them use it. And how exactly the Necrontyr first made meaningful contact with the Satan is a matter of debate that will probably never be definitively resolved, given that the events in question took place 60 million years ago, and every surviving account is filtered through layers of bias and mythology. The archives of Solemnas say it was an accident, a stellar probe that stumbled upon the Satan's electromagnetic signature while investigating the energy patterns of a dying star. The Aeldari's Book of Mournful Night suggests something more sinister, claiming that the raw hatred of the entire Necrontyr species sang out across the void like a psychic beacon, irresistible to entities that fed on energy in all its forms. And there are other accounts still, each offering its own version, each colored by the agenda of its authors. What matters is the result. A contact was established. The Satan, curious about these small mortal beings who had managed to detect them, condescended to communicate. And the Necrontyr, desperate for allies and burning with a hatred that had been distilled and concentrated over centuries of exile, found in the star gods exactly what they had been looking for. The Satan, known as Mephetron, the deceiver, was the one who brokered the alliance. Not the most powerful of the star gods, the deceiver was by far the most cunning, the most skilled in the arts of persuasion and manipulation. It came before the silent king, Zarek, and it spoke with honeyed words that addressed every fear and promised everything the Necrontyr had ever wanted. It told the silent king that the Satan too had fought the Old Ones in some unimaginably ancient conflict, and a war that the Satan had lost. Whether this was true, or just another of the deceiver's countless lies, has never been determined with certainty. But the story served its purpose. It presented the Satan as fellow victims, as kindred spirits united by shared suffering, as natural allies in a righteous cause. And the deceiver offered something that cut straight to the heart of every Necrontyr's deepest, most desperate longing: immortality. The process was called biotransference. The Necrontyr would give up their fragile, radiation-ravaged flesh and transfer their consciousness into bodies of living metal called necrodermis. These new bodies would never age, never sicken, never know the humiliating, drawn-out degradation that was the Necrontyr's birthright. They would be free from the curse of their biology forever. The Silent King debated the offer for a year. His court was bitterly divided. Orican the Diviner, the most brilliant astrologer among the Necrontyr, warned against accepting. He foresaw that the price would be catastrophic, that the Satan were offering a bargain that looked golden on the outside, but was rotten at the core. But Orican's warnings were overridden. The weight of millions of years of suffering was too heavy. The promise of salvation was too bright. Sarek accepted. Vast biofoundries were constructed across the Necrontyr Empire, cyclopean structures of dark metal and blazing energy. Into these furnaces, the Necrontyr marched, dynasty by dynasty. Not all went willingly. Those who resisted had their limbs broken and were carried screaming to the transformation chambers on ghost arcs. Yet at least one resistance movement formed around a Pharaon named Nephreth the Untouched, who rallied opponents into a last stand of defiance. It was later revealed that Nephreth was not a Necrontyr at all, but a fragment of the Deceiver wearing the shape of a disease-free leader, a false flag operation designed to gather all dissent in one place for efficient elimination. Even their rebellion had been anticipated. Even their defiance was part of the trap. What happened inside the biofoundries was something between a surgery and a sacrifice. Each Necrontyr who entered was stripped of their flesh, their organs, their biological substance, all of it dissolved and replaced by frameworks of living metal. But they were also stripped of something else, something the Satan had conveniently forgotten to mention in their sales pitch: their souls. Above each biofoundry, the true forms of the Satan swooped and circled, gorging themselves on the cascade of spiritual energy that poured upward from the transformation process. Every soul, every spark of consciousness, every fragment of identity and emotion and lived experience was consumed by the star gods. What emerged from the far side of the process was not a Necrontyr in a new body. It was a mechanical shell animated by the faintest echo of the person it had once been. When the Silent King himself emerged from biotransference, he understood at last the full, crushing weight of what he had done. His new body was stronger, faster, free of pain. His thoughts were clearer than they had ever been. But there was a hollowness inside him that no processing power could fill, an absence where warmth had once been, and a void where his soul had lived. He looked out across the ranks of his transformed subjects and saw not his people, but an army of ghosts dressed in metal, their glowing eyes empty of everything that had once made them alive. The common Necrontyr, the workers and artists and parents and children, had been reduced to mindless automata. Only the highest-ranking nobles retained enough complexity in their neural engrams to approximate anything resembling personality, and even they were diminished, mechanical shadows of the beings they had been. The Necrontyr were dead. The Necrons had been born. And the Satan, bloated with the spiritual harvest of an entire species, stood at the height of their power, ready to resume the war that would reshape the galaxy forever. The biotransference was not instantaneous. It did not happen all at once, and across the entire Necrontyr Empire in a single cataclysmic moment. It rolled across the dynasties in waves, each wave carrying with it a fresh tide of horror as the reality of what was being done became clearer and clearer to those who had not yet entered the furnaces. The first dynasties to undergo the process did so with something approaching willingness, even enthusiasm. They had heard the deceiver's promises. They had been told that immortality awaited them on the other side of the biofurnaces, that the pain and weakness and slow deterioration that had defined their existence would be replaced by strength and permanence, and the freedom to pursue whatever goals they chose without the constant weight of mortality dragging them down. Some of them probably walked into the furnaces with smiles on their radiation-scarred faces, genuinely believing that they were about to be liberated. What emerged from the other side was unrecognizable. The first reports from the biofoundries were confusing, contradictory, and deeply unsettling. The beings that walked out of the furnaces had the general shape of necrontia, their bodies crafted from necrodermis, in forms that echoed, in a cold and metallic way, the organic bodies they had left behind. But there was something wrong with them, something missing. Their movements were precise but mechanical, lacking the small, unconscious adjustments and variations that characterize living beings. Their voices, when they spoke, had a flat, atonal quality that stripped all emotion from their words. And their eyes, those glowing pinpoints of green or amber light that served as optical sensors in their new faces, had none of the warmth, and none of the depth, none of the indefinable spark that distinguishes a thinking being from a cleverly designed machine. The necrontyre, who had not yet undergone biotransference, began to have second thoughts. Whispers circulated through the waiting crowds at the biofoundries. Frightened questions were asked of the tech priests and scientists who oversaw the process. What happened to them in there? Why do they seem so different? Where is the light behind their eyes? The answers they received were reassuring on the surface. Explanations about adaptation periods and system calibration, and the time needed for consciousness to fully integrate with its new housing. But beneath the reassurances, there was a growing unease among those who had designed and implemented the process, because the truth, which the leadership could not afford to acknowledge publicly, was that the transformation was taking far more from its subjects than had been anticipated. The souls that the Satan were consuming were not some metaphysical abstraction that could be detached from a person without affecting their fundamental nature. They were the person. They were the seat of consciousness, the core of identity, the irreducible essence of what it meant to be a thinking, feeling, individual being. Without their souls, the Necrons were not immortal versions of themselves. They were machines that happened to contain the fading echoes of people who had once existed. Some dynasties resisted. The resistance was more widespread than the official histories of the Necron dynasties would later acknowledge, which is perhaps understandable, given that admitting the scale of the opposition would require admitting the scale of the atrocity that had been committed against the unwilling. Entire populations attempted to flee the biofoundries, only to be rounded up by enforcement squads loyal to the Triarch. Pharaohs who refused to submit their subjects to the process were deposed, often violently, and replaced with more compliant successors. The Ghost Arcs, those spectral transports that would become a staple of Necron military forces in later ages, were originally designed for this purpose, to carry broken, struggling, screaming Necrontyr to the biofurnaces against their will. The most organized resistance came from the Pharaon Nephrith the Untouched, a figure who became a symbol of hope for those who opposed biotransference. And Nephrith was unique among the Necrontyr leadership in that he appeared to be completely free of the cancers and degenerative conditions that plagued his species. His body was healthy, his mind sharp, his spirit unbroken by the slow deterioration that bent and twisted every other Necrontyr who had ever lived. He argued, with considerable persuasiveness, that biotransference was unnecessary, that the Necrontyr's biological problems could be solved through other means if sufficient research were devoted to the task, and that surrendering their organic bodies to the Satan was a betrayal of everything the Necrontyr were and everything they could become. Thousands rallied to his banner, tens of thousands. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed as though the opposition to biotransference might actually succeed, or that enough of the Necrontyr might refuse the process to force a reconsideration of the Triarch's decision. And then the truth about Nephrith was revealed. He was not a Necrontyr at all. He had never been a Necrontyr. He was a cast-off fragment of the Deceiver, a shard of the Satan that had assumed Necrontyr form and insinuated itself into the resistance movement with the express purpose of gathering all opposition to biotransference in one place, under one banner, where it could be efficiently identified, contained, and neutralized. Nephrith's apparent immunity to disease was not a miracle of biology, but a simple consequence of the fact that he was not biological at all. He was a god playing dress-up, and the people who had placed their hopes in him had been duped by the oldest and most skilled manipulator in the cosmos. When the deceiver's trap was sprung, the resistance collapsed overnight. Its leaders were seized. Its followers were marched to the biofurnaces at gunpoint, and the biotransference continued, wave after wave after wave, until the last Necrontyre dynasty had been processed and the transformation of an entire species was complete. Sarek, the Silent King, watched all of this happen and said nothing. His title was not merely ceremonial. The Silent Kings of the Necrontyre had a tradition of speaking rarely and acting decisively, and Sarek, the last of his line, embodied this tradition with a severity that bordered on the pathological. He had agreed to the biotransference. He had authorized it. He bore responsibility for every soul that was consumed, every identity that was erased, as every life that was transformed from something real and vibrant and alive into something cold and hollow and eternal. And when he himself emerged from the biofurnace and felt the terrible emptiness where his soul had been, when he looked upon the ranks of his newly minted Necron subjects and saw in their glowing eyes nothing but the void, he understood that he had committed the greatest atrocity in the history of sentient life. He had not merely killed his people, he had erased them, replaced them with copies that looked like them and sounded like them and carried their names and titles but were, in every way that mattered, something fundamentally different, something less. The guilt of this realization would follow Sarek for the next 60 million years, through the remainder of the war in heaven, through the revolt against the Citan, yes, through the Great Sleep, through his long, lonely exile in the intergalactic void. The Silent King carries the weight of an entire species' damnation on his shoulders, and the fact that he cannot feel that weight as a physical sensation, because the biotransference took from him the capacity for physical sensation along with everything else, only makes it worse. He remembers what guilt felt like when he was alive. He can reconstruct the emotional state from his memories, but he cannot experience it directly. He is haunted by the ghost of an emotion that he can no longer feel, which is perhaps the cruelest punishment that the universe could have devised for his crime. The culture that grew up around this shared misery was, in many ways, a monument to defiance. The Necrontyre built grand things, not despite their short lives, but because of them. Their architecture was dominated by tombs and memorials, yes, but these were not the crude, unadorned crypts of a species that had given up on beauty. They were extraordinary structures, vast and intricate and decorated with carvings and inscriptions that spoke of a people who poured everything they had into the time they were given. If you only have a few decades to leave your mark on the universe, then by every god you can name, you are going to make those decades count. Their art reflected this urgency. Necrontyre visual art tended toward the stark and the dramatic, with bold lines and dark colors and subjects that confronted mortality head-on rather than flinching away from it. Their literature, what little can be reconstructed from the fragmentary records that survived the biotransference, was preoccupied with themes of legacy and remembrance, stories about heroes who achieved great things in their brief span and were remembered long after their bodies had returned to dust. Their music, if the acoustic profiles preserved in some of the more intact Tomb World archives are any indication, favored deep, resonant tones and complex harmonic structures that seemed to vibrate with a weight and a gravitas that went beyond mere aesthetic preference, as if every note was meant to say, "I was here, I existed, remember me." And their science was, in many ways, the most remarkable product of their culture, driven by the desperate need to understand and combat the forces that were killing them. As Necrontyre scientists achieved breakthroughs in physics, chemistry, engineering, and biology that were astonishing given the limitations under which they worked. They developed interstellar travel. They built colonies on distant worlds. They created technologies that, while not on the same level as the old one's psychic engineering, were nonetheless impressive by the standards of any mortal civilization. And all of this was accomplished by researchers who knew they would not live to see the fruits of their labor, who worked knowing that the projects they started would have to be finished by others, who dedicated their brief lives to pushing the boundaries of knowledge a little further in the hope that the next generation, and the generation after that might eventually find the answers that had eluded them. This was the tragedy of the Necrontyr. They were not evil. They were not inherently destructive. They were a people defined by suffering and shaped by the desperate desire to overcome it, and in different circumstances, with a different star overhead and a few more centuries of lifespan to work with, they might have become something beautiful. Instead, they became something terrible, not because of what they were, but because of what was done to them, first by the star that cursed them, and then by the ancient species that refused to help them. The wars of secession that tore the Necrontyr Empire apart before the First War with the Old Ones were not simple territorial disputes or power struggles. They were the inevitable result of a species pushed past its psychological breaking point. When your life is short and painful, yet when every day brings a little more deterioration, a little more loss, a little more of the slow slide toward oblivion, the temptation to lash out at the universe becomes overwhelming. And when the universe is too big and too indifferent to serve as a satisfying target, you turn on the people around you, because at least they will scream when you hit them. Dynasty fought dynasty with a brutality that shocked even the Necrontyr's own historians. Worlds were depopulated. Fleets were destroyed. Technologies that had taken generations to develop were turned to the sole purpose of killing other Necrontyr more efficiently. The Triarch watched in growing horror as the unity of their species disintegrated, not because of any external threat, but because the Necrontyr were simply too angry, too hurt, too fundamentally broken by their existence to maintain the social cohesion necessary for a functioning civilization. It was this internal collapse, as much as anything else, that drove the Triarch to seek war with the Old Ones. The war was not just a strategic decision. It was a psychological lifeline, a way of redirecting the rage that was consuming the Necrontyr from within and pointing it at an external target that could absorb the blow without the species destroying itself in the process. In a grim way, it was an act of triage, a recognition that the Necrontyr's self-destructive impulses had to go somewhere, and that it was better to aim them at a powerful enemy than to let them continue to tear the Empire apart from the inside. The exile to the Halo stars after the First War's failure only intensified these dynamics. Now the Necrontyr were not just dying and angry, they were dying and angry and humiliated. The defeat at the hands of the Old Ones had confirmed everything they feared about their place in the universe, that they were weak, that they were insignificant, that the cosmos had no place for them and no interest in their survival. The hatred that had driven them to war metastasized into something darker, a cold, calculating nihilism that no longer cared about glory or honor or even revenge in any passionate sense. What the Necrontyr wanted now was simply for the Old Ones to hurt, to lose what they had, to know what it felt like to have everything you cared about taken away. It was in this psychological state, this perfect crucible of desperation and hatred and existential despair, that the Necrontyr's scientists detected the first anomalous readings in the electromagnetic spectra of the ancient stars they were studying, readings that did not correspond to any known physical process. Readings that suggested the presence of something alive within the nuclear furnaces of the oldest suns in the galaxy. The discovery of the Satan was not a sudden revelation, but a gradual process of accumulating evidence and escalating astonishment. The first readings were dismissed as instrument error. The second set was attributed to unusual stellar dynamics. The third set could not be explained away so easily, and a dedicated research program was established to investigate further. Over the course of years, which for the Necrontyr represented a significant fraction of any individual researcher's expected lifespan, the evidence mounted until it became undeniable. There were intelligences living inside the stars, not physical beings in any conventional sense, not organisms with bodies and cells and metabolic processes, but patterns, vast, intricate, impossibly complex patterns of electromagnetic force that persisted and evolved and responded to stimuli in ways that could only be described as intelligent. They existed as standing waves in the plasma of stellar interiors, their thoughts expressed as variations in magnetic field strength, their communications conducted through modulations of X-ray emissions that carried information in frequencies that had never been previously monitored, because no one had ever imagined that they might carry meaning. Yet the Necrontyre scientists who made this discovery must have experienced something very close to religious awe. Here, hidden in plain sight within the very stars that had cursed their species with short lives and painful deaths, were beings of unimaginable power and unthinkable age. Beings that had been old when the galaxy was young. Beings whose existence predated every other form of sentient life in the cosmos, including the hated Old Ones. And these beings had no connection to the warp. None whatsoever. They existed entirely within the material universe, their consciousness rooted in the electromagnetic forces that governed the behavior of matter and energy. The dimension that the Old Ones had mastered, the realm from which they drew all of their power and all of their strategic advantage. It was as irrelevant to the Satan as the color of a sunset is to a creature that has no eyes. They were blind to the warp, yes, but they were also immune to it, and that immunity, in the context of a war against the warp-wielding Old Ones, was the most valuable strategic asset imaginable. The process of giving the Satan physical bodies, of constructing the necrodermis shells that would allow these vast stellar intelligences to compress themselves into forms small enough to interact with the material world on a scale that mortal beings could perceive, was itself a feat of engineering that pushed Necrontyre technology to its absolute limits. The necrodermis had to be more than mere metal. It had to be a living substance, capable of containing and channeling energies that normally operated on stellar scales. It had to be self-repairing, as adaptive, responsive to the will of the consciousness it contained. And it had to be able to withstand the internal pressures of a being whose natural state was to spread across the surface of a star. Building a body for a Satan was not like building a suit of armor. It was like building a bottle capable of holding an ocean. When the first Satan crossed what the Necrontyre called the incorporeal starlight bridge, the threshold between its stellar existence and its new material form, the event was probably the most significant moment in galactic history up to that point. Azagorod, the being that would come to be known as the Nightbringer, was the first to make the crossing, drawn to the Necrontyre's own sun, the very star that had cursed their species since the beginning. It compressed itself into the necrodermis body that had been prepared for it, and in that instant, an entity that had existed for billions of years as a diffuse pattern of electromagnetic force in the heart of a star became a coherent, focused, material being for the first time. And the first thing it did was start killing the Necrontyre who had summoned it. The Nightbringer found, to its surprise and delight, that the life energy of mortal beings tasted far better than the bland electromagnetic diet it had subsisted on for the past several billion years. The focused, concentrated essence of a living consciousness, the spark of awareness that distinguished a person from a thing, was an intoxicating delicacy compared to the flavorless energy of stellar fusion. The Nightbringer consumed the scientists who had brought it into the world, while drinking in their terror and their agony with a pleasure that was almost sensual, and it would have continued consuming every Necrontyre within reach if the surviving members of the summoning team had not managed to negotiate a ceasefire by promising the Satan something even better than a few hundred panicking scientists. They promised it a war, an entire galaxy full of living beings to feed upon, and the Nightbringer, newly aware of appetites it had never known it possessed, was very, very interested. The second war against the Old Ones was nothing like the first. Where the initial Necrontyre offensive had been a fumbling, outmatched assault by mortal soldiers against an overwhelmingly superior enemy, this new campaign was something else entirely. It was an apocalypse, and a systematic dismantling of everything the Old Ones had spent millions of years building, conducted with the cold efficiency of machines and the unlimited power of gods. The Necrons did not need to eat. They did not need to sleep. They did not need to breathe or rest or recover from the psychological trauma of combat. They did not suffer from supply shortages or logistical bottlenecks, or any of the thousand mundane problems that plague mortal armies. Their bodies repaired themselves, knitting together damage that would have been fatal to biological organisms with a quiet, mechanical patience that seemed almost meditative. And behind the endless ranks of tireless metal warriors came the Citan, no longer content to lurk in the hearts of stars, but striding across the galaxy in bodies of living metal, or wielding powers that bent the very laws of physics to their will. The Nightbringer, Azagorod, was perhaps the most viscerally terrifying of the star gods. It did not merely fight, it terrorized. It fed on the fear and anguish of living beings, the way a connoisseur savors a rare vintage, and it cultivated that terror with an artistry that was as appalling as it was effective. Entire civilizations were subjected to its attentions, their populations driven to madness by nightmarish visions that the Nightbringer projected directly into their minds. It reached into the deepest, most primal layers of every sentient species' psychology and planted there an image that would never fade. The hooded figure, the skeletal face, the scythe that reaps the living, that image, the universal archetype of death personified, appears in the mythology of nearly every intelligent species in the galaxy, and every single one of those mythological traditions traces its origin back to the Nightbringer's campaign of psychological warfare during the War in Heaven. It taught the galaxy to fear death, and it did so because the flavor of that fear sustained it like food and drink. The Void Dragon, Magladroth, brought a different and perhaps even more destructive kind of devastation. Where the Nightbringer was a predator driven by hunger and sadism, the Void Dragon was a creator, a being whose understanding of the material universe ran so deep that it could reshape reality itself with the casual ease of a sculptor working in soft clay. Under its guidance, the Necrons developed technologies that the Old Ones, for all their ancient wisdom, could not comprehend, let alone counter. Weapons that could project beams of temporal energy, aging anything they touched by millions of years in a fraction of a second, reducing warships to corroded hulks and living beings to dust in the blink of an eye. Devices that could generate gravitational singularities on command, creating localized black holes that swallowed everything within their event horizons with the indiscriminate hunger of cosmic vacuums. And most ominously, the Void Dragon conceived the plans for a system of warp suppression pylons, massive structures designed to sever the connection between the material universe and the Imperium entirely, cutting the Old Ones off from the dimension that was the source of all their power, like a surgeon cutting an artery. The deceiver, Mephetran, continued to ply its trade of lies and misdirection, sowing confusion among the Old Ones' allies, planting false intelligence, engineering betrayals and misunderstandings that cost the Old Ones dearly in lives and strategic position. The deceiver understood that the most devastating weapon in any war is not a gun or a planet killer, but information, and specifically the corruption of information. A battle won through superior firepower is just a battle won. A battle won because the enemy made decisions based on information you planted in their intelligence networks is a demonstration of total strategic superiority. The deceiver excelled at this kind of warfare, and its machinations multiplied the effectiveness of the Necron legions far beyond what their raw numbers and firepower would suggest. Together, yes, the Citan and their Necron servants achieved what had seemed impossible during the First War. They overwhelmed the Old Ones' strategic advantage. The Webway, that great network of instant transit tunnels that had made the Old Ones untouchable during the first conflict, was breached. The Citan, called Nyadrazaf, the Burning One, showed the Necrons how to tear open crude doorways into the Webway using brute force rather than elegant psychic engineering. These dolmen gates, as they came to be called, were rough and unstable compared to the Old One's original portals. The Webway's own defenses constantly worked to seal them shut, like an immune system attacking a foreign body. But they held long enough for Necron legions to pour through, and for the first time in history, And the Old Ones found themselves under attack in the one place they had always considered inviolable. Planets were razed. That simple sentence cannot convey the horror of what it describes, so let us dwell on it for a moment. When we say that planets were razed, we do not mean that cities were bombed or that populations were displaced. We mean that entire worlds, spheres of rock and iron and water that had orbited their stars for billions of years, that had developed ecosystems of staggering complexity and beauty over geological timescales, that hosted millions of species and billions of individual living things, were reduced to barren, lifeless husks. Some were simply sterilized, their surfaces scoured clean of life by weapons that operated on principles so alien that the Old Ones could not even determine how they worked, much less develop countermeasures. Others were consumed entirely, their matter and energy fed to Citan, whose appetites grew more voracious the more they consumed. And some were simply erased, collapsed into gravitational singularities, or displaced into pocket dimensions, or subjected to temporal weapons that aged them past the point of heat death, leaving nothing behind but cold, dark stones drifting through empty space where once there had been warmth and life and the sounds of living things. Suns were extinguished. Again, the simplicity of the sentence belies the enormity of the act. A star is not a campfire that can be casually snuffed out. It is a nuclear furnace of almost inconceivable power, a sphere of superheated plasma millions of kilometers across, burning with an energy output that could power 1,000,000 civilizations for 1,000,000 years. To extinguish a star is to commit an act of destruction on a scale that dwarfs anything a mortal mind can easily conceptualize. And the Citan did it casually, almost playfully, snuffing out the fires at the cores of stars the way you might pinch out a candle flame, leaving behind cold, dark remnants that would drift through space for eternity, monuments to the power of beings that viewed solar systems as expendable resources. The Old Ones, for all their ancient wisdom, for all their mastery of the warp, and their deep understanding of the fundamental forces that governed reality, found themselves being pushed back. Their fortresses were besieged and overrun, their webway was compromised, their psychic weapons, which had always been their greatest strength, were useless against enemies that existed entirely outside the framework of the Imperium. The Citan had no souls, no presence in the warp, no vulnerability to the psychic attacks that the Old Ones had relied upon for millions of years. Fighting the Citan with psychic weapons was like fighting water with fire. The attack simply passed through the target without touching it, leaving the attacker exposed and the enemy unharmed. The younger species that the Old Ones had so carefully nurtured over the preceding millions of years were not spared. The Citan fed upon them with a ravenous appetite that grew more intense the more it was satisfied. Great red harvests swept across thousands of worlds, and the Citan descending upon populated planets and consuming the life energy of every sentient being they could find. Entire species were driven to extinction in these harvests, their members consumed one by one until there were none left, their existence erased from the galaxy as thoroughly as if they had never been. The paradise that the Old Ones had created was being unmade. Their carefully tended garden was being burned to the ground, its flowers trampled, its trees felled, its soil poisoned with the residue of weapons that corrupted the very fabric of reality. Everything they had spent millions of years building was crumbling, and for what must have been the first time in their incomprehensibly long existence, the Old Ones knew genuine despair. But they were not ready to surrender. Not yet. Their civilization was ancient beyond measure. The Old Ones reached deep into their reserves of knowledge and creativity and produced what might be the most audacious gamble in the history of intelligent life. They decided to create new species, warrior species, races specifically designed from the ground up to fight and kill the enemies that were destroying everything the old ones had ever built. This was not the patient, careful cultivation that had characterized the old ones' earlier efforts at species development. There was no time for that now. No time for the gentle guidance of evolution across geological timescales. Or no time for the careful balancing of genetic traits and the slow nurturing of cognitive development. The old ones needed soldiers, and they needed them as fast as their prodigious talents could produce them. The key insight that drove their design philosophy was elegant in its simplicity. The C'tan were creatures of pure material reality, beings of matter and energy with absolutely no connection to the warp. This meant that while they were immune to psychic attack, they were also vulnerable to the energies of the Imperium in a fundamental way that had never been exploited. The warp was an anathema to the C'tan, a force of existence that they could not manipulate, could not shield against, could not even fully perceive. If the old ones could create species with inherently powerful connections to the warp, the species that could channel the Immaterium's energy as naturally and effortlessly as breathing, those species might be able to wound the C'tan in ways that conventional physical weapons simply could not. The first and most sophisticated of these engineered warrior races were the beings who would eventually become known throughout the galaxy as the Aeldari. The Aeldari were designed with a singular purpose that was then layered over with such exquisite biological and psychic complexity that the purpose itself became almost invisible, hidden beneath surfaces of grace and beauty and intellectual refinement. At their core, they were weapons, but they were weapons disguised as works of art, and the artistry was not incidental to their function, but integral to it. Their psychic abilities were extraordinary and surpassing those of any species that had ever existed. Every Aeldari was born with a connection to the warp so powerful that it suffused every aspect of their being, from their remarkably acute senses to their ability to perceive and manipulate the currents of the Immaterium with a precision that bordered on the instinctive. They did not need to be trained to use psychic powers the way human psykers must be trained, wrestling with abilities that their biology was never designed to support. The Aeldari were designed for it. Their brains were structured to process psychic input alongside physical sensation, weaving the two into a unified experience of reality that gave them advantages in perception, reaction time, and situational awareness that no purely physical species could match. They were graceful, or with bodies that combined strength and agility in proportions carefully calibrated to maximize their effectiveness in both psychic and physical combat. They were long-lived, their lifespan stretching across centuries, giving them time to develop their abilities to their full and devastating potential. They were intelligent, creative, passionate, possessed of emotional lives so rich and so intense that every feeling, every experience, every moment of consciousness resonated through the warp like the plucking of a cosmic string. In many ways, the Aeldari were the Old One's masterwork, the purest expression of their understanding of the relationship between biological life and the psychic dimension. Yet they were a species in which the material and the immaterial were woven together so seamlessly that the boundary between the two became almost meaningless. A living bridge between dimensions, a conduit through which the power of the warp could be channeled and directed with devastating effect. But the Old Ones needed more than just psychic warriors. They needed physical resilience, brute strength, the ability to absorb punishment and keep fighting long after lesser species would have broken. They needed shock troops, meat shields, an unstoppable wave of biological fury that could crash against the Necron legions and keep crashing until the metal broke. And so they created the Krork. If the Aeldari were a scalpel, the Krork were a sledgehammer. If the Aeldari were a sonnet, the Krork were a war cry. They were huge. Here are some specimens standing as tall as 12 meters, their bodies packed with muscle fiber so dense that even their smallest warriors could have torn a human being in half without particular effort. They were tough, their physiology incorporating so many redundancies and backup systems, that killing one was less like killing an organism and more like trying to demolish a building by pulling out individual bricks. They regenerated from wounds that would have been immediately fatal to any other species. They laughed in the face of pain, and they reproduced through spores, which meant that every battlefield where Krork fought became a nursery for the next generation, the genetic material of fallen warriors seeding the soil and giving rise to new soldiers within months, rather than the decades or centuries that conventional reproduction required. More of the Krork also possessed something that would later prove to be one of the most significant and least understood phenomena in the galaxy: a collective psychic field. When enough Krork gathered in one place, their combined psychic emanations created a field of shared belief and willpower that could subtly but significantly alter reality in their immediate vicinity. Their weapons hit harder than the laws of physics said they should. Their armor deflected blows that should have penetrated it. Their vehicles functioned despite designs that would have made any rational engineer weep with frustration. It was psychic power, expressed not through deliberate intent, but through sheer collective conviction, or a reality-warping force generated by beings who were simply too stubborn and too enthusiastic about violence to accept that the universe had rules they were supposed to follow. Beyond the Aeldari and the Krork, the Old Ones created numerous other species during this period of frantic innovation. The Canib, mysterious 10-limbed creatures described in the fragmentary records as festering, whose exact nature and capabilities have been lost to time. The Rashan, about whom almost nothing is known beyond their name and their apparent psychic abilities. The Jokairo, those curious orange-furred beings with an instinctive talent for technology so profound that they could disassemble and improve complex machinery by pure intuition, without any conscious understanding of engineering principles. And there were others, unnamed and unrecorded. Races created in haste as the Old Ones scrambled to assemble an army that could stem the tide of extinction washing across the galaxy. Even the distant ancestors of humanity may have been touched by the Old Ones during this period. On a small, unremarkable world orbiting a medium-sized yellow star, the tree-dwelling primates that would eventually give rise to Homo sapiens received a gentle nudge along the path toward intelligence. But humanity was not a priority. The Old Ones had bigger problems to deal with. The primates of Terra would have to fend for themselves. It took time for these new species to mature, millennia. And during those millennia, the Citan and their Necron legions continued their methodical destruction of everything the Old Ones had built. More worlds burned, more suns went dark. But more carefully nurtured species were consumed in the red harvests that fed the star gods' insatiable hunger. But the Citan were not the perfectly united force they appeared to be. Even as they waged their war of annihilation against the Old Ones, the star gods were turning on each other. The Nightbringer, driven by a hunger that seemed to grow more ravenous the more it was fed, discovered that the essence of other Citan was the most intoxicating delicacy it had ever tasted. Whether it was the Deceiver who encouraged this cosmic cannibalism, or Segorach, the enigmatic laughing god of the Eldari Harlequin tradition, who tricked the Nightbringer into devouring its own kin, the result was a culling that reduced the once numerous Catan to just 4 surviving star gods: the Nightbringer, the Deceiver, the Void Dragon, and the Outsider. Yet this last one, driven so mad by the horror of consuming beings of its own kind that it withdrew entirely from the galaxy, fleeing to a Dyson sphere beyond the edge of the Milky Way to gibber in solitary madness for eternity. By the time the Old Ones' new warrior races were finally ready for deployment, the balance of power had shifted. 4 Citan remained instead of dozens. The Necrons were spread thin across a galaxy-spanning front, and the young races were ready to fight. The Aeldari struck first, and they struck with devastating effect. Their psychic powers burned through Necron warriors with an efficiency that sent shockwaves through the enemy's command structure. The raw energy of the warp, channeled through minds specifically designed for exactly this purpose, was an absolute anathema to the soulless metal bodies of the Necrons. And systems glitched and failed in the presence of concentrated psychic force. Self-repair protocols were disrupted. Command networks were scrambled. For the first time since biotransference, the Necrons found themselves at a genuine disadvantage. The Krork hit the Necron battle lines like a green tidal wave, their massive bodies smashing through formations that had held against everything the Old Ones had previously thrown at them. Where the Aeldari fought with surgical precision, the Krork fought with a gleeful, roaring, unstoppable savagery that seemed to feed upon itself, growing more intense the longer the battle lasted. Their collective psychic field disrupted Necron targeting systems, scrambled communications, and infused the Krork warriors themselves with a resilience and ferocity that exceeded anything their already formidable biology could account for alone. For the first time since the C'tan had entered the war, the tide was turning. The Old Ones' desperate gamble was paying off. The young races were pushing the Necrons back, reclaiming territory that had been lost, liberating worlds that had been conquered, even forcing the C'tan themselves to retreat from positions they had considered secure. Victory, after so many millennia of defeat and retreat and slow, agonizing loss, seemed within reach, almost within reach, because the Old Ones, in their desperation, had made a mistake. Not a small mistake, not a tactical error or a strategic miscalculation. They had made a mistake so fundamental, so far-reaching, so profoundly consequential that its effects would reshape the galaxy more thoroughly than anything the C'tan had done, and would continue to reverberate across the next 60 million years of galactic history. They had changed the warp. The breaching of the webway deserves particular attention, because it represented a violation so profound that its psychological impact on the Old Ones may have been as significant as its strategic consequences. For millions of years, the webway had been inviolate. It was the one place in the galaxy where the Old Ones were absolutely, unquestionably safe. No matter how badly the war went in the material universe, no matter how many worlds were lost or how many suns were extinguished, the Old Ones could always retreat into the webway, seal the gates behind them, and regroup in a space that no enemy could reach. It was their ultimate sanctuary, the one constant in an increasingly chaotic and terrifying war. When the Burning One showed the Necrons how to tear dolmen gates into the webway's walls, it was not merely a tactical development. It was the destruction of the Old Ones' last sense of security. The one place they had always been able to count on as safe was safe no longer. The one refuge that had endured through every previous crisis had been compromised. The psychological blow of this realization must have been staggering, especially for a species that had relied on the webway as the foundation of its civilization for longer than most stars had been burning. The dolmen gates themselves were crude, ugly things, more like wounds in the fabric of the webway than proper doorways, or were unstable ruptures that the webway's own defenses constantly tried to seal. Maintaining a dolmen gate required continuous effort from the Necron cryptechs, who had developed the technology, and even at their best, the gates were unreliable, prone to sudden closure or dimensional fluctuation that could strand or destroy forces that were in the process of transiting. But reliability was not the point. Access was the point. The Necrons poured through every dolmen gate they could force open, their metal legions flooding into the webway's tunnels and turning a space that had been designed for peaceful transit into yet another battleground. The battles fought inside the webway were particularly horrific because the confined spaces of the tunnels favored the Necrons' relentless, grinding style of warfare over the Old Ones' more mobile, psychically based approach. There was no room to maneuver, no space to fall back and regroup, no opportunity for the kind of strategic repositioning that had served the Old Ones so well in the material universe. Inside the webway, the war devolved into something brutal and attritional, a claustrophobic nightmare of close-quarters combat in tunnels that shook with the impact of weapons designed for open battlefields, being discharged in enclosed spaces. And as the dolmen gates multiplied and the Necron presence within the webway grew, the psychic wards that protected the tunnels from the energies of the warp began to weaken. Each dolmen gate was a breach, and each breach allowed a trickle of warp energy to seep in, eroding the wards from the outside, while the fighting within strained them from the inside. Sections of the webway began to collapse or become contaminated, their tunnels flooded with the corrupted energies of the warp, and their gates warped beyond use. The old ones were forced to make agonizing decisions about which sections of the webway to defend and which to sacrifice. Every sealed tunnel was a piece of their civilization amputated. Every abandoned gate was a world cut off from the network, left to face whatever came without the support that had sustained it for millions of years. The webway was dying piece by piece, and with it died the last remaining infrastructure of the Old One's galactic empire. As this is the context in which the Enslaver Plague must be understood. It did not arrive at a time when the Old Ones were strong and confident and in control of their destiny. It arrived at a time when they were already reeling, already depleted, already watching their greatest creation crumble around them. The Enslavers were not the cause of the Old One's destruction. They were the final blow, the last in a series of catastrophes that had been building for millions of years, each one weakening the Old Ones further and making them more vulnerable to the next. By the time the Enslaver Plague reached its peak, the Old Ones' ability to mount a coordinated response had been fatally compromised. Their webway was in ruins. Their armies were scattered. Left to draw upon. No hidden armies left to draw upon. No hidden armies waiting in the wings. No last resort weapons that could turn the tide at the 11th hour. What they had was each other. And one by one, even that was taken from them. There is a particular kind of tragedy in watching a brilliant mind solve the wrong problem. The Old Ones were facing an enemy that was immune to their most powerful weapons, and their solution, creating new species with psychic abilities strong enough to harm the Satan, was logically sound. Psychic energy was anathema to beings of pure material existence. The Satan could not defend against it. The mathematics of the situation were clear. Create enough psychic firepower, and the tide of the war would turn. And they were right. The strategy worked. The young races did exactly what they were designed to do. They hurt the Satan. They pushed back the Necron legions. They reclaimed territories that had been lost and defended strongholds that had been on the verge of falling. From a purely tactical standpoint, the Old Ones' decision was vindicated on every battlefield where their creations were deployed. But the Old Ones were not just solving a tactical problem. They were making fundamental changes to the psychic ecology of the entire galaxy, and they either failed to recognize or chose to ignore the implications of what they were doing. Creating billions of psychically active beings, and then subjecting them to the most intense and prolonged period of warfare the galaxy had ever known, was like lighting a bonfire in a room full of dry tinder. The question was never whether the warp would be affected. The question was how badly and how fast. The creation of the Aeldari alone would have had significant consequences for the Imperium. A species with souls that blazed like beacons in the warp, experiencing emotions at an intensity that no previous species had achieved, would inevitably leave a mark on a dimension that was fundamentally shaped by the psychic emissions of material beings. But the Old Ones did not create just the Aeldari. They created dozens of psychically active species, possibly hundreds, each one adding its own unique signature to the growing cacophony of psychic noise that was flooding into the Imperium from a galaxy at war. The Canib contributed their own strange energies to the mix. Little is known about this species, but their description as festering, 10-limbed creatures suggests something deeply alien, something whose psychic emissions might have been as foreign to the warp's existing ecology as an invasive species introduced into a previously balanced ecosystem. The Ration added their voices to the chorus, along with every other species that the Old Ones engineered during this period of frantic innovation, and the effect was cumulative. Each new species did not simply add its own individual contribution to the warp's corruption. It interacted with every other contribution already present, creating interference patterns and resonance effects that amplified the overall impact far beyond what a simple sum of individual contributions would suggest. The warp did not darken gradually, in a smooth and predictable curve. It darkened in fits and starts, in sudden surges of corruption that corresponded to moments of particular intensity in the war, to great battles where millions of psychically active beings experienced extremes of emotion simultaneously. Think of it like a body of water being polluted by dozens of different sources, each one pouring a different kind of contaminant into the same lake. Individually, each source might be manageable. The lake's natural filtration systems could handle the input, break down the pollutants, maintain a livable equilibrium. But when all of those sources are active at the same time, and when the contaminants interact with each other in unpredictable ways, creating new compounds and new toxins that the lake's ecosystem has no defenses against, the whole system can collapse with a speed and totality that catches everyone off guard. That is what happened to the warp. The individual psychic contributions of the Old One's created species combined and interacted in ways that no one had predicted, producing effects that were qualitatively different from anything the Imperium had experienced before. The entities within the warp did not simply grow larger and more aggressive. They began to develop something that they had never possessed before: purpose, direction, will. Where once they had been formless, reactive, essentially animalistic in their behavior, now they began to act with intention, to pursue goals, not to make plans. Some of these entities, fed by the specific emotional frequencies that dominated the galaxy during the war in heaven, began to take on aspects that reflected the dominant themes of the conflict: rage, fear, despair, ambition. These emotional resonances attracted corresponding entities, which grew and fed and merged and divided and grew again, slowly coalescing into something that had never existed before in the history of the Imperium. Focused, coherent, self-aware wills that were sustained by the emotions of material beings, and that could, in turn, reach back across the veil between dimensions and influence those beings in return. These were the proto-entities that would, over the course of millions of years of further development, eventually become the Chaos Gods. They were not yet the fully formed, self-aware intelligences that they would become in later ages. They were more like currents in an ocean, powerful and directional, but not yet possessing anything that could be called a mind in the traditional sense. But they were growing, and the fact that they were growing at all was a consequence of the Old One's desperate strategy of creating psychically active warrior species and throwing them into a galactic conflict that generated the exact kind of intense, focused emotional energy that such entities needed to sustain themselves. The Old Ones may have been aware of these proto-entities. Given their deep understanding of the warp and their millions of years of experience with psychic phenomena, it seems unlikely that they would have missed something so significant. But even if they noticed, they may not have understood the implications. The Imperium had always contained entities of one kind or another. The Old Ones had spent their entire existence managing and manipulating the energies of the warp, and they may have assumed that these new developments were simply another variation on a familiar theme, something that could be contained and managed using the same techniques they had always employed. They were wrong. But by the time the full extent of their error became apparent, it was far too late to do anything about it. The corruption of the warp was not the only unintended consequence of the Old One's creation strategy. The species they had designed for war, particularly the Krork, had been given certain traits that were useful in the short term, but potentially catastrophic in the long term. The Krork's spore-based reproduction, for instance, was a brilliantly efficient mechanism for sustaining a warrior species during a prolonged conflict. But it also meant that the Krork were essentially impossible to eradicate. Every world where Krork fought became permanently infested with their spores, which could lie dormant for millennia before germinating and producing a new generation of warriors. The Old Ones had created a species that could not be eliminated, short of sterilizing every planet it had ever set foot on, and in the middle of a galaxy-spanning war, that was not even remotely practical. The Krork's genetically encoded knowledge of warfare was similarly double-edged. It ensured that every Krork warrior was combat effective from the moment of its birth, and which was invaluable during the War in Heaven, when replacement troops were needed faster than any conventional training program could produce them. But it also meant that the Krork were permanently locked into a warfare-centric existence, unable to develop beyond the parameters that the Old Ones had set for them, unable to adapt to peacetime conditions that their genetic programming did not account for, because the Old Ones, in their desperation, had not thought to include a peacetime mode. These were species designed for a specific crisis, optimized for a particular set of conditions, and then released into a universe that would eventually present them with conditions wildly different from the ones they had been designed to handle. It was like designing a firefighting robot so perfectly for extinguishing fires that it could not function in any other context, and then being surprised when it continued to spray water at everything it encountered long after the fires had been put out. The Old Ones were brilliant. They were creative. They were, by the standards of any species that has ever existed, the most accomplished biological engineers the galaxy has ever produced. But they were also desperate, and desperation has a way of narrowing one's focus, of making the immediate problem seem so urgent and so overwhelming that the long-term consequences of one's solutions barely register. The Old Ones solved the immediate problem of the C'tan and the Necrons. But in doing so, they created a whole new set of problems that would haunt the galaxy for the next 60 million years. The scale of the destruction visited upon the galaxy during this phase of the war is something that even the most detailed historical accounts struggle to convey. We are accustomed to thinking of war in terms of individual battles, campaigns fought over months or years for control of specific territories or strategic objectives. The War in Heaven was nothing like this. It was an existential conflict fought across the entire galaxy, simultaneously, for millions of years, with no truces, no ceasefires, no diplomatic pauses, no moments of respite in which either side could catch its breath and reassess its position. Picture a galaxy map. Now imagine that at every point on that map, on every world, in every star system, as around every lonely sun drifting in the void between the spiral arms, there is fighting, not skirmishing, not raiding, fighting, full-scale, industrial-grade warfare waged with weapons capable of snuffing out stars and tearing open the fabric of reality. The energy expenditures involved dwarf anything that has occurred in the galaxy since. The death tolls, measured across millions of years and billions of worlds, are numbers so large that they cease to have any meaningful human significance. They are abstractions, figures on a ledger that the universe has long since balanced and filed away. The C'tan consumed entire star systems the way you might eat a meal, methodically, efficiently, without waste or sentiment. They would descend upon a populated system and begin by extinguishing the local star, not because this was tactically necessary, but because the star was, in a very real sense, food. The energy released by a star's death throes, focused and channeled through the C'tan's necrodermis body, could sustain one of the star gods for millennia. The death of the star system's inhabitants, the billions of sentient beings who froze or suffocated or were incinerated in the moments after their sun went dark, was almost an afterthought, a bonus harvest of life energy that sweetened the main course of stellar fuel. The Red Harvests, as these operations came to be known, were conducted with a systematic thoroughness that revealed the C'tan's fundamental nature. These were not acts of cruelty performed for their own sake, though the Nightbringer in particular certainly seemed to derive a perverse pleasure from the suffering of its victims. But they were acts of consumption. The C'tan were feeding, plain and simple, and the younger races that the Old Ones had nurtured were nothing more than livestock, organisms that produced a particularly tasty form of energy, and could therefore be cultivated, harvested, and consumed without any more moral consideration than a farmer gives to a field of wheat. The Old Ones watched these horrors with what must have been a combination of rage and heartbreak. These were their children being devoured, species they had spent millions of years carefully cultivating, ecosystems they had designed with meticulous attention to detail, entire civilizations whose first tentative steps toward consciousness they had lovingly guided. And now those civilizations were being consumed by beings that saw them as nothing more than fuel. And it was this emotional dimension of the war that made the Old Ones' eventual decision to create warrior species so fraught with consequences. They were not creating weapons in a vacuum. They were creating weapons out of necessity, driven by the desperation of watching everything they had ever built being destroyed before their eyes. And that desperation, that anguish, that burning need to protect the young species that depended on them for survival, colored every aspect of the creation process in ways that the Old Ones may not have fully appreciated at the time. When they designed the Aeldari, for instance, they did not merely give them strong psychic abilities. They gave them intense emotions, passions that burned hot and bright and consumed their subjects with a fervor that no other species in the galaxy could match. An Aeldari's joy is brighter than a human's, their sorrow is deeper, their anger is fiercer, their love is more consuming, and their hatred is more implacable. Every emotion they experience is amplified, magnified, turned up to a volume that would overwhelm a less psychically attuned being. This was by design. The Old Ones understood that psychic power is fueled by emotional intensity, and they built the Aeldari to feel things as strongly as possible so that they could channel those feelings into the warp and draw upon its energies with maximum efficiency. But they apparently did not stop to consider what would happen when an entire species of beings capable of experiencing emotions at this intensity was exposed to the horrors of galactic warfare. They did not ask what it would mean for the warp, when billions of Aeldari minds were simultaneously experiencing terror and rage and grief and hatred at levels that no species had ever felt before. They did not calculate the psychic footprint that such intense emotional output would create in the Imperium, or predict how that footprint would interact with the already disturbed energies of a dimension that had been absorbing the psychic runoff of a galaxy at war for millions of years. The Krork presented different problems. Where the Aeldari's contribution to the warp's corruption was emotional, the Krork's was more primal. Their collective psychic field, that strange gestalt of belief and aggression that grew stronger the more of them gathered in one place, it operated on a frequency that was entirely distinct from the Aeldari's refined psychic emanations. If the Aeldari's emotions were like a symphony being played at tremendous volume, the Krork's psychic output was more like a drumbeat, a constant rhythmic pounding that resonated through the warp in a way that was less dramatic, but arguably more pervasive and more disruptive. The Krork believed, with a conviction that bordered on the metaphysical, that fighting was the natural and proper state of all existence. Their entire worldview was structured around the concept of combat. They did not merely enjoy fighting. They existed to fight. It was their purpose, their religion, their art, their science, and their philosophy, all wrapped into one seamless cultural package. And this belief, and held simultaneously by billions of Krork minds across thousands of worlds, projected into the warp a constant, unrelenting message. The universe is a place of war, and war is good, and war is right, and war is the only thing that matters. The warp, being a dimension that reflects and amplifies the psychic emissions of material beings, took this message and ran with it. The energies of the Imperium began to organize themselves around martial themes, forming eddies and currents that resonated with concepts of conflict, aggression, and competitive dominance. Entities within the warp that had previously been formless and purposeless began to take on aspects that reflected these themes, growing more aggressive, more territorial, more inclined to clash with one another and with anything else that crossed their path. Meanwhile, was the species that the Old Ones had created earlier in their history, the ones that had not been specifically designed for war, were also contributing to the warp's degradation in their own ways. The suffering of innocence has its own psychic signature, and across the galaxy, billions of non-combatant beings were experiencing levels of fear and grief and despair that they had never been subjected to before. Worlds that had known nothing but peace for millions of years were suddenly plunged into the most brutal conflict the galaxy had ever seen, and the psychic shock of that transition sent waves of distress rippling through the Imperium, like the aftershocks of an earthquake. Every one of these individual contributions to the warp's corruption might have been manageable in isolation. A single species' emotional output, even an intensely psychic species like the Eldari, might not have been enough to fundamentally alter the nature of an entire dimension, but they were not occurring in isolation. They were occurring simultaneously across the entire galaxy, building on one another and reinforcing one another in a cascade of psychic pollution that fed back upon itself and grew stronger with each passing generation. The warp was becoming something new, something that had never existed before, something that the old ones, for all their wisdom, for all their understanding of the Immaterium's nature and dynamics, had never imagined was possible. It was becoming the warp that we know in the 41st millennium, a dimension of nightmares and predators and gods born from the darkest impulses of sentient minds. And the old ones, whose entire civilization was built on the assumption that the Immaterium was a stable, manageable, exploitable resource, were watching the foundation of their power crack and shift beneath them like ice on a warming lake. They could see what was happening. They were too intelligent, too experienced, too deeply attuned to the currents of the warp to miss the signs. But they could not stop it. To stop it, they would have had to stop the war. And the war could not be stopped because the Necrons and the Citan would not stop. And the Necrons and the Citan would not stop because they had no reason to stop, because they were winning, because every day that the war continued brought them closer to their goal of the total extermination of the old ones and everything they had ever created. It was a trap of cosmic proportions, and a feedback loop with no off switch. The war generated psychic emissions. The psychic emissions corrupted the warp. The corrupted warp made the war harder to fight. The harder the war became, the more desperately the old ones had to fight, generating more psychic emissions, corrupting the warp further, making the war harder still. Round and round and round, spiraling downward toward a catastrophe that everyone could see coming, but no one could prevent. And from the depths of that corrupted dimension, things were beginning to emerge. Things that were not merely predatory, but parasitic. Things that did not simply feed on psychic energy from a distance, but actively sought out sentient beings and exploited their psychic connections for purposes that went beyond mere hunger into something that could only be described as reproductive. What the enslavers had found their way to the buffet, and the feast was about to begin. The mechanics of what the enslavers did are worth understanding in some detail, because it was the specific nature of their parasitic cycle that made them so uniquely devastating to the old ones and their allies. When an enslaver detected a suitable host, a psyker with a strong connection to the warp, it did not simply take control of the victim's motor functions the way a puppeteer manipulates a marionette. The process was far more insidious than that. The enslaver first established a psychic link with its target, a tenuous connection that was initially so subtle that even a powerful psyker might not notice it. Through this link, the enslaver gradually increased its influence over the victim's mind, eroding their willpower, suppressing their resistance, yet slowly replacing their thoughts and desires with the enslaver's own imperatives. The victim, during this process, often showed no external signs of being compromised. They continued to behave normally, to carry out their duties, to interact with their colleagues and companions as if nothing were wrong. This was one of the most terrifying aspects of the enslaver plague. You could not tell who had been taken. The warrior fighting beside you, the psyker defending your stronghold, the leader directing your forces, any of them might already be under an enslaver's control, and you would not know until it was too late. Once the enslaver had established complete dominance over its host, the final stage of the parasitic cycle began. The victim's body began to change, physically transforming into a living warp gate through which more enslavers could enter the material universe. This process was invariably fatal. The host's flesh distorted and tore, their psychic essence consumed from within as the portal opened. But by that point, the damage was already done. The newly arrived enslavers would immediately begin seeking new hosts of their own, and the cycle would repeat, each generation of parasites producing more gateways, each gateway admitting more parasites, the whole process escalating exponentially until entire worlds were overrun. For the Old Ones, who had deliberately created species with strong psychic connections to the warp, this was nothing less than a worst-case scenario. The very trait that made the Ieldari and the other young races so effective against the Necrons, yet their powerful link to the Imperium, was exactly the trait that made them most vulnerable to the enslavers. Every psyker on every battlefield was a potential gateway. Every planet where the young races had established a presence was a potential outbreak site. The Old Ones' own weapons were being turned against them, not by the Necrons, not by the Citan, but by the warp itself, or rather by the predatory entities that the warp's corruption had given birth to. The Old Ones responded to the enslaver plague with the same creative genius that had characterized their approach to every previous crisis. They created more species, new races designed to be resistant to psychic domination, tough enough to fight enslavers in hand-to-hand combat, and resilient enough to survive on worlds that had been overrun by the plague. The Krork may have been one of these late-stage creations, designed specifically with the durability and psychic resistance needed to operate in an environment saturated with enslaver activity. The Jokero, with their technological genius and their relative lack of psychic vulnerability, might have been another, but it was too little, too late. The enslaver plague was spreading faster than any countermeasure could contain it, and the Old Ones, already exhausted by millions of years of warfare against the Necrons and the Citan, simply did not have the resources to fight on this new front, while simultaneously holding the line against their existing enemies. Their webway, their greatest creation, and their most vital strategic asset, became a liability. The psychic wards that protected the webway's tunnels from the energies of the warp had been designed for a calm, stable Imperium, not for the roiling storm of corrupted energy that now raged on the other side of the walls. The wards began to fail, slowly at first, then with increasing frequency and severity. Enslavers found ways to infiltrate the webway, either through the compromised wards or through the minds of the psychically gifted beings who used the tunnels as highways. The Old Ones began sealing off sections of their own network, destroying gates and collapsing tunnels to prevent the plague from spreading through the entire system. Each sealed gate was a world cut off. Each collapsed tunnel was a community of Old Ones and their younger allies left to fend for themselves, and isolated from the support network that had sustained them for millions of years. The empire of the Old Ones was being dismembered piece by piece, not by the swords of its enemies, but by its own desperate self-surgery, the amputation of limbs to save the body. But the body was already dying. The Necrons continued to advance, their soulless metal forms utterly immune to the enslaver's psychic predation. The Citan continued to feed, their appetites undiminished by the chaos that surrounded them, and the warp continued to darken, its corruption deepening with every passing year as the emotions of a galaxy at war poured into it without cease. The Old Ones' final days are shrouded in mystery, their specifics lost to the vastness of time. We do not know which was the last stronghold to fall. We do not know the name of the last Old One to die, or the name of the world on which they drew their final breath. We do not know if there was a last stand, a final desperate battle in which the Old Ones threw everything they had against their enemies and went down fighting, or if the end came more quietly, a slow fading of lights across the galaxy as the last outposts were overrun and the last survivors fled into whatever refuge they could find. What we do know is that the civilization of the Old Ones did not survive. The combination of the Necron onslaught from without and the Enslaver plague from within proved to be more than even the oldest and most powerful species in the galaxy could endure. Their strongholds were overrun, their webway was shattered, their created species were scattered and broken, left to fend for themselves in a galaxy that had become a graveyard. And the Old Ones themselves either died or fled, vanishing from the stage of galactic history so completely that within a few million years, most of the species they had created had forgotten they had ever existed, remembering them only as mythological figures, gods or demons, or ancestors whose names had been worn smooth by the passage of time until they were nothing more than sounds without meaning. Remember that the Imperium, the dimension that would later become known simply as the Warp, had once been calm, peaceful, a vast, serene ocean of psychic energy that reflected the relatively tranquil state of a galaxy that had, until recently, been under the benevolent stewardship of beings who valued harmony and balance above all else. The entities that inhabited it were harmless, formless wisps of psychic potential drifting without purpose or direction. The Old Ones had mastered this dimension, built their entire civilization upon their ability to manipulate its energies with precision and safety, and they had never, in all their millions of years of existence, had reason to fear it. But the Warp is a mirror. It reflects the psychic state of the material universe. Every emotion felt by every sentient being, every surge of joy or stab of grief, every flash of rage or tremor of fear, all of it bleeds through the barrier between dimensions and shapes the Immaterium's nature. In a galaxy at peace, the Warp is peaceful. In a galaxy at war, the Warp becomes something else entirely. And this galaxy was not merely at war. It was engulfed in a conflict of unprecedented scale, duration, and savagery. But the war in heaven had been raging for millennia by this point, and the emotional fallout was beyond anything the Immaterium had ever been exposed to. Billions upon billions of sentient beings were fighting, suffering, dying across thousands of worlds. The fear of soldiers facing Necron legions that could not be permanently killed. The grief of species watching their worlds consumed by the red harvests of the Citan. The rage of warriors throwing themselves against enemies that showed no mercy and offered no quarter. The despair of civilizations watching everything they had built reduced to ash and silence. All of this was pouring into the Immaterium in a continuous, unending flood of psychic energy, raw and hot, and charged with the most intense emotions that living beings could produce. And the species the Old Ones had created were making it exponentially worse. The Aeldari, with their blazing psychic potential, were not just channeling warp energy into weapons against the Necrons. They were also, by the simple fact of their existence, pumping emotional energy into the Immaterium at a rate that no previous species had ever achieved. Their every feeling, every sensation, every moment of consciousness was amplified by their powerful psychic natures and broadcast into the Warp like a signal from a transmitter that could never be switched off. The intensity of Aeldari emotion, the depth and richness of their inner lives that made them such effective psychers, also made them the most prolific producers of psychic pollution the galaxy had ever seen. The Krork contributed their own unique brand of corruption. But their collective psychic field, that shared aura of aggressive willpower that made their weapons hit harder and their armor hold stronger, was not a focused or directed force. It was a constant grinding emanation of warlike energy, a psychic background radiation of bloodlust and competitive fury that saturated the Warp wherever Krork gathered in sufficient numbers. And the Krork were always gathering in sufficient numbers, because that was what they were designed to do. Fight, multiply, fight some more. A never-ending cycle of violence that pumped war energy into the Immaterium with the relentless regularity of a heartbeat. The change was gradual at first, so gradual that the Old Ones, preoccupied with the existential threat of the Necron onslaught, might not have noticed it until it was far too late to stop. Yet the innocuous entities that had once drifted peacefully through the Imperium began to change. Fed by the flood of psychic energy pouring in from the material universe, nourished by emotions of unprecedented intensity and volume, they grew. They became more defined, more coherent, more capable of sustained, purposeful action. The formless wisps developed shapes, the mindless drifters developed appetites, and those appetites, fed by the dominant emotional energy flooding the warp, were hungry ones, aggressive ones, predatory ones. The warp was becoming a hostile environment. The once calm dimension was now churning with currents of dark energy, its depths clouded by the psychic residue of a galaxy at war, and its formerly harmless inhabitants evolving into creatures that bore as little resemblance to their original forms as a wolf bears to the single-celled organism from which it evolved, given enough time and the right selective pressures. Except that in the warp, evolution could happen in centuries rather than millions of years, because the medium was not matter but thought, and thought could change with dizzying speed. The old ones noticed. Of course they noticed. They were the most psychically attuned species in the galaxy, and the changes occurring in the dimension they had mastered were impossible to miss. But they found themselves trapped in a cycle from which there was no escape. They could not stop the war, because the Necrons and the Satan would not stop. They could not withdraw the species they had created, but because those species were the only things standing between the old ones and total annihilation. They could not prevent the warp from changing, because the warp was changing in response to the psychic output of billions of beings engaged in a conflict that could not be ended without one side or the other ceasing to exist. Every action the old ones took to defend themselves against the Necrons generated more of the psychic energy that was corrupting the warp. Every battle fought, every world defended, every life lost or saved in the name of survival added to the flood. It was a feedback loop of the most vicious kind, a spiral that could only tighten, never loosen, and at the bottom of that spiral, waiting with a patience that seemed almost deliberate, was the final doom of the oldest civilization in the galaxy. From the deepest, darkest corners of the now corrupted Imperium, something new began to stir. These were not the harmless wisps that had once populated the warp, grown large and dangerous. These were something fundamentally different. Entities that seemed purpose-built for invasion, for exploitation, for the subjugation of sentient minds. They were drawn to psychic energy the way a moth is drawn to a flame, able to sense the emissions of a sapient mind across distances of up to 10 light years. And when they found what they were looking for, specifically a psyker, a being with a strong connection to the warp, they could reach across the barrier between dimensions and seize that mind with a completeness that left no room for resistance, no hope of rescue, no possibility of escape. History remembers them by many names. The Krell, the Sirens, the Dominators, the Puppeteers. But the name that has endured the longest and carries the most weight is also the simplest and the most descriptive: the Enslavers. In appearance, they were nightmares given form, semi-translucent entities that resembled grotesque hybrids of jellyfish and arachnids, their bodies pulsing with the psychic energies that sustained them, their appendages reaching out with an alien purpose that had nothing to do with the needs or desires of any mortal species. They existed at the boundary between the warp and the material universe, able to perceive both dimensions simultaneously, hunting across the gulf between realities for the psychic signatures that marked their prey. Their method of invasion was as simple as it was horrifying. An enslaver would detect the psychic emissions of a sentient being, home in on that signal, and reach out with its mind to seize control of its target. The victim did not die. That would have been merciful. Instead, they retained all of their knowledge, all of their abilities, all of their physical attributes, but their will was erased, replaced by the alien imperatives of the enslaver that had claimed them. They became puppets, their bodies moving and acting and fighting at the direction of a consciousness that viewed them as nothing more than tools to be used and discarded. But the true horror of the enslavers went beyond mere mind control. Because once an enslaver had seized a psychically gifted host, it could use that host's connection to the warp as a gateway, a living portal through which more enslavers could force their way into the material universe. The process was invariably fatal for the host. Their body and mind consumed from within as the portal opened and the enslavers poured through. But that was of no concern to creatures that viewed sentient beings as nothing more than disposable door handles. In the context of the war in heaven, this ability was catastrophic beyond measure. The Old Ones had spent millennia creating psychically powerful species specifically designed to have strong, stable connections to the warp. The Aeldari, the Krork, the Canib, the Rashan, all of them were blazing beacons of psychic energy, easily detectable by the enslavers across vast distances and, in many cases, vulnerable to their mind-controlling abilities. The very weapons the Old Ones had forged to save themselves from the Satan were now targets for a new enemy that attacked not through the material universe, but through the dimension the Old Ones had always considered their safest refuge. The Enslaver Plague erupted across the galaxy with a speed and ferocity that caught everyone by surprise. Not just the Old Ones, but the Necrons, the Citan, and the young races as well. This was not a localized incursion or a minor border incident. This was a pandemic on a galactic scale, a wave of psychic parasites that swept across thousands of light years in what seemed like an instant, exploiting the cracks in reality that the war had opened and the psychic connections of every sentient species as gateways for their invasion. Entire worlds were overrun in days. The process was efficiently straightforward. An enslaver would detect a psyker on a populated world, seize control of their mind, and use their body as a portal. More enslavers would pour through. Each new enslaver would find more psykers, more hosts, more gateways. The invasion cascaded exponentially, spreading through a world's psychically gifted population like a wildfire through dry brush. Within days, every psyker on the planet would be compromised, their bodies transformed into gateways, their minds erased. And the enslavers that poured through those gateways would then turn their attention to the non-psychic population, seizing control of ordinary minds with only slightly less ease, building armies of puppets that obeyed their every command without hesitation or resistance. The Old Ones' carefully constructed armies turned against them. As warriors who had been bred and trained and deployed to fight the Necrons were instead turned into enslaver puppets, their powerful psychic abilities now serving as conduits for the very entities that were destroying their creators. The irony was as bitter as it was total. The weapons the Old Ones had forged to save themselves had become the instruments of their destruction, not through any failure in their design, but through an unforeseen consequence of the conditions their design had helped to create. The Old Ones tried to fight back. They were, after all, the most powerful psychic species in the galaxy, and they had more knowledge of the warp and its workings than any other living beings. They attempted to counter the enslavers with barriers and wards and targeted psychic attacks. They created still more new species, as trying to engineer beings that could resist enslaver control while still maintaining their effectiveness against the Necrons. The Krork may have been specifically created during this final, desperate phase of the conflict, their relative psychic crudeness and their sheer physical resilience making them somewhat harder for the enslavers to subvert than the more psychically refined Aeldari. The Jokero may have been another product of this last burst of frantic creation, their technological intuition offering a form of combat capability that did not depend on psychic powers and was therefore less vulnerable to enslaver exploitation. But it was too late. The enslaver plague was spreading faster than any countermeasure could contain it. Every day brought new infestations on new worlds, and every week saw another sector of the galaxy fall to the parasites, its population reduced to puppets, its psychic resources co-opted as gateways for further invasion. The Old One's intergalactic network was collapsing, The webway itself was compromised, as enslavers found ways to access its tunnels through the minds of the psychically gifted beings who used them. In a desperate attempt to slow the spread, the Old Ones began destroying their own webway portals, sealing off sections of the network, abandoning the worlds they connected. It was the galactic equivalent of a surgeon amputating limbs to stop the spread of gangrene, a brutal, agonizing process that left the surviving Old Ones increasingly isolated, increasingly cut off from each other, increasingly unable to coordinate the kind of galaxy-spanning response that the crisis demanded. And through it all, the Necrons kept coming. The Satan kept feeding. The war that had been devastating the galaxy for millennia did not pause for the Enslaver plague. If anything, the Necrons pressed their advantage harder, recognizing that their enemies were now fighting on two fronts and exploiting the confusion and disarray that the plague had created. The Necrons themselves were immune to the Enslavers, of course. They had no souls, no psychic signatures, no vulnerability to the kind of psychic domination that the Enslavers employed. The plague that was destroying the Old Ones and their allies was nothing more than a convenient distraction to the Necron legions, who continued their methodical advance while their enemies tore themselves apart. The end, when it came, was not a single dramatic moment, but a long, agonizing process of dissolution. The Old Ones' strongholds fell one by one, overwhelmed by combinations of Necron assault and Enslaver infestation that they simply could not counter. Their places of power were overrun. Their great works of psychic engineering were corrupted or destroyed. The species they had created were scattered and broken, left to fend for themselves in a galaxy that had become a charnel house. Some sources suggest that the Old Ones fought to the very end, their last bastions holding out against impossible odds until there was nothing left to hold. Others suggest that some of them chose to flee, abandoning the galaxy entirely and seeking refuge in dimensions or spaces beyond the reach of both the Necrons and the Enslavers. Or the truth is probably some combination of both. Some Old Ones stood their ground and were destroyed, while others retreated through whatever webway portals remained functional and vanished into regions of space so remote or dimensions so alien that no one has ever been able to follow them. What is certain is that the civilization of the Old Ones, the first and greatest galactic empire in the history of the Milky Way, was utterly and completely destroyed. Not by a single enemy, not by a single cause, but by the combined, cascading weight of multiple catastrophes converging simultaneously, each one feeding into the others in a spiral of destruction that even the most ancient and powerful species in existence could not survive. The Necrontyre's jealousy gave rise to the war. The Satan's hunger gave the Necrons the power to wage it. The Old Ones' desperation drove them to create psychically powerful species. Those species' existence corrupted the warp. The corrupted warp spawned the Enslavers. The Enslavers used the Old Ones' own creations as weapons against them, and all the while, the war continued, grinding forward with mechanical efficiency, consuming more lives and more worlds, and generating more of the psychic pollution that was feeding the entire cycle. It was the most perfectly tragic chain of cause and effect in the history of the galaxy. Every link forged by beings who were only trying to survive, who could see no other option, who chose the least terrible of the terrible choices available to them, and watched as even those choices produced consequences worse than the problems they were meant to solve. The Old Ones were not destroyed by stupidity. They were not destroyed by arrogance, though they may have been guilty of a certain cosmic overconfidence. They were destroyed by the simple, terrible fact that in a universe this complex, this interconnected, this sensitive to the ripple effects of every action and every decision, even the wisest beings can set in motion chains of events that spin beyond their ability to control. They planted seeds across the galaxy, and those seeds grew into things they never intended. They created life, and that life changed the warp, and the changed warp destroyed them. They built the webway, and the webway was breached. They mastered the Imperium, and the Imperium became their enemy. Everything they were best at, everything they relied upon, everything that had made them the dominant force in the galaxy for millions of years. What was turned against them in the end. And the galaxy they left behind was a wasteland, a graveyard, a place where the echoes of the greatest war ever fought still reverberated through the fabric of reality, shaping the warp into the hellscape that the Imperium of man would one day know and fear, seeding the potential for the chaos gods that would eventually coalesce from the accumulated psychic residue of 60 million years of suffering. In the immediate aftermath of the Old One's fall, the galaxy was a place of almost incomprehensible desolation. The enslaver plague raged on, consuming what little sentient life remained, turning world after world into hives of psychic parasites and their mindless thralls. The webway, damaged and partially sealed by the Old One's own desperate attempts to contain the plague, as it drifted in the space between dimensions like the skeleton of a great beast, its tunnels dark and empty, where once the traffic of a galaxy-spanning civilization had flowed. And across thousands of worlds, the ruins of the Old One's civilization lay silent, their purposes already beginning to be forgotten by the few surviving species who lacked the context to understand what they were looking at. But the Necrons and their Catan masters did not get to enjoy their triumph. The silent King Sarek had been biding his time throughout the final stages of the war, watching and waiting for the moment when his hated Star God masters would be most vulnerable. He had understood, with a cold clarity, that his mechanical mind was perfectly suited to maintain across the long millennia of the conflict. That the Old Ones had to be completely defeated before he could move against the Satan. If he had turned on the Star Gods while the Old Ones were still fighting, the Necrons would have found themselves caught between two enemies, and neither war could be won under those circumstances. But now the Old Ones were gone, scattered, destroyed, driven from the galaxy, and the Satan, though still immensely powerful, were exhausted from their long war, weakened by their own internal cannibalism, and, critically, distracted by the enslaver plague that was consuming the very life energy they depended upon for sustenance. The sentient beings that the Satan needed to feed upon were being enslaved and consumed by the enslavers faster than the Star Gods could harvest them, and for the first time in their existence, the Satan were facing the prospect of starvation. Sarek struck. Using the command protocols that had been embedded in every Necron mind during biotransference, he turned the entire Necron species against the Satan in a single, coordinated instant. It was perhaps the most perfectly executed military operation in the history of the galaxy, a surprise attack launched simultaneously across thousands of worlds by an army that moved as one, because its commander had absolute, unbreakable control over every unit in his order of battle. The Necrons focused the vast energies of the living universe into weapons, god-killing devices of a type that had never existed before and have never been replicated since. Hypercannons and reality-warping projectors too powerful for even the Star Gods to endure. The Satan, taken completely by surprise, fought back with all the cosmic fury at their disposal. But they were no longer at the peak of their power, and the Necrons had spent millennia studying their weaknesses and devising the tools to exploit them. The Satan were not destroyed, because beings of their fundamental nature cannot truly be destroyed. They were broken, shattered into fragments, each one a pale echo of the terrifying cosmic entity it had once been part of, still immensely powerful, but no longer capable of the galaxy-shaking feats that the intact Satan had performed during the war in heaven. These fragments, later called Citan shards, were imprisoned within arcane devices known as Tesseract labyrinths, extra-dimensional prisons from which not even a Star God's remnant could escape. The shards were kept by the Necrons, and to be deployed as weapons of last resort in future conflicts, living reminders of the terrible bargain that had cost the Necrontyr everything they were. But Zarek's victory tasted of nothing. His people were still soulless, still mechanical, still haunted by the ghostly echoes of the living beings they had once been, echoes too faint to provide comfort, but too persistent to allow the kind of total oblivion that might have passed for peace. He looked out across the galaxy and saw a wasteland. The enslaver plague was still raging. The old ones were gone. The young races, particularly the Aeldari, were beginning to assert themselves in the power vacuum left by the old ones' disappearance, and they were growing stronger with each passing century. And the Necrons, immortal but exhausted, soulless but aware, victorious but empty, were in no condition to face these emerging threats. Zarek made a decision that was either an act of supreme strategic wisdom or an expression of profound despair, and perhaps it was both. He ordered the Necrons to withdraw from the galaxy, all of them, every dynasty, every legion, every warrior. They would return to their tomb worlds, the hidden subterranean fortresses that had been prepared long ago for exactly this contingency, and they would enter a state of dormancy known as the Great Sleep. There, sealed beneath the surfaces of 100,000 worlds, they would wait. Wait for the enslaver plague to burn itself out. Wait for the galaxy to recover from the devastation of the war in heaven. Wait for the moment when conditions were right for them to emerge and reclaim what they believed was rightfully theirs. Before entering his own period of exile, Zarek performed one final act as the ruler of the Necron species. He destroyed the command protocols that gave him absolute control over every Necron mind. It was an act of penance, a recognition that the power he had wielded over his subjects was a tyranny made possible by the very process that had robbed them of their freedom. He would not carry that burden into whatever came next. Whatever the Necrons became when they awoke, they would become it as free beings, for whatever that freedom was worth, to minds that could no longer feel its significance. Then the Silent King departed into the void between galaxies, accompanied by legions of his own Zarakan dynasty in stasis crypts, seeking penance for the crimes he had committed against his own species in the vast, cold emptiness between the stars. He would not return for 60 million years. The enslaver plague, deprived of the vast populations of psychically gifted beings it needed to sustain itself, gradually subsided. Without enough living psychers to serve as gateways, fewer and fewer enslavers could cross into the material universe, and those that did found a galaxy so depopulated that there was insufficient prey to maintain their numbers. The plague that had nearly extinguished all sentient life burned itself out over the course of millennia, leaving behind a galaxy that was silent, empty, and scarred beyond recognition by the wars that had ravaged it. Into this silence stepped the Aeldari. The Old One's masterwork, their most sophisticated creation, proved to be the species best equipped to survive the aftermath of the war in heaven. They had psychic abilities powerful enough to defend themselves against the enslavers, but disciplined enough to avoid being overwhelmed. They had inherited access to the remains of the Old One's webway, and over the course of the millions of years that followed, they would expand and perfect it into a galaxy-spanning network of transit tunnels that would become the backbone of their own magnificent civilization. The Aeldari civilization, at its height, was a thing of extraordinary beauty and power. They mastered psychic abilities to a degree that would have made even the Old Ones nod in quiet approval. They developed technologies of staggering sophistication, including the psychically resonant material known as wraithbone, which they used to construct everything from delicate musical instruments to massive war machines. They built cities that spanned entire planets, their architecture so perfectly attuned to the psychic landscape of the warp that simply walking through their streets was said to be a transcendent experience, a communion with the fundamental harmonies of the universe that left visitors changed forever. But the Aeldari also carried within them the seeds of their own destruction, a legacy of the Old One's desperate engineering that would not bear its bitter fruit for millions of years, but that was, in a sense, inevitable from the moment of their creation. The same powerful connection to the warp that made them such effective warriors against the Necrons also made them uniquely sensitive to its corrupting influences. Their intense emotions, amplified by their psychic natures, bled into the warp with every feeling, every sensation, at every moment of pleasure or pain. And the Aeldari were a species that felt everything intensely. Their joys were higher, their sorrows deeper, their passions more consuming than those of any other species in the galaxy. It was what made them what they were, and it was what would eventually destroy them. Over the course of millions of years, as the Aeldari civilization grew more powerful and more decadent, as its members explored every possible extreme of experience and sensation in an endless quest for new forms of stimulation, the psychic residue of their excess accumulated in the warp. Slowly, imperceptibly, over geological timescales, that residue began to coalesce, to take shape, to develop something that might be called awareness, and eventually, after millions of years of accumulation, it woke up. Slaanesh, the Prince of Excess, the she who thirsts. Born from the concentrated psychic residue of the Aeldari's own hedonism and self-indulgence, Slaanesh's birth was an apocalypse in its own right. The newborn chaos. God's first scream tore a hole in reality itself, creating the vast warp rift known as the Eye of Terror, and the psychic shockwave of its awakening killed the majority of the Aeldari species in a single, annihilating instant. Their souls, connected to the warp by the very bonds that the Old Ones had engineered into their biology, were consumed by the entity their own excesses had created. It was the Old Ones' curse, playing out across a timescale so vast that no one, not even the Old Ones themselves, could have predicted it. The species they had created to save themselves from the Necrons had, through the inevitable consequences of its own nature, given birth to a god that destroyed it. The cycle of cause and effect that had begun with the Necrontyre's jealousy continued to turn, each revolution producing new catastrophes from the wreckage of the old, and the galaxy continued to pay the price for choices made 60 million years before. And the Orcs. Let us not forget the Orcs, the devolved descendants of the mighty Krork, their massive forebears who had once stood 12 meters tall and fought with technologies and tactics that made the current Orc species look like children playing with sticks. The Krork had been engineered as the perfect warriors, but without the Old Ones' guidance, without the brain boys who were supposed to coordinate their efforts and direct their energies, they had slowly degraded over the millions of years since the War in Heaven. Their technology regressed. As at the deepest level of their genetic makeup, fight. Fight everything. Fight always. Fight forever. The Orcs spread across the galaxy like a green tide, infesting every corner, every crevice, every world that would support their remarkably resilient biology. They fought each other when there was no one else to fight, and they fought everything else when the opportunity presented itself. They were the Old Ones' weapon, still active millions of years after the war it had been created for had ended, still carrying out its programming with a cheerful, mindless dedication that would be admirable if it were not so terrifyingly destructive. And on the tomb worlds, beneath the surfaces of 100,000 planets scattered across the galaxy, the Necrons slept. Their bodies in stasis, their systems on standby, their consciousness suspended in whatever passed for dreams among beings who no longer possessed the biological hardware to dream. 60 million years of silence, 60 million years of darkness, 60 million years during which the galaxy above them changed beyond all recognition. New species rising and falling, new empires building and crumbling. The great wheel of galactic history turning and turning without them. They are waking up now. In the 41st millennium, the tomb worlds are stirring. Ancient systems are coming online. Self-repair protocols are activating after 60 million years of dormancy. And the Necron overlords who emerge from their crypts and look upon the galaxy with eyes that glow with the cold light of stolen consciousness find a universe that is utterly alien to them, populated by species that did not exist when they went to sleep, filled with wars and conflicts and threats that they never imagined. And yet, for some of the most ancient and well-preserved Necron minds, for beings like Trazyn the Infinite, with his obsessive collection of historical artifacts, or Imhotep, the Stormlord, with his vast strategic intelligence. The war in heaven was not ancient history. It was yesterday. They remember the old ones. They remember the Satan. They remember the desperation and the horror and the choices that were made. And they carry those memories forward into a galaxy that has no idea what is coming. The echoes of the Old One's destruction continue to reverberate through the 41st millennium in ways both obvious and subtle. The webway, their greatest creation, still exists, maintained and expanded by the Aeldari, who inherited it, but never fully understood by its inheritors, who lack the Old One's deep comprehension of the principles upon which it was built. The Dark Aeldari, the Drukhari, have made the webway their home, building the vast, dark city of Komorach within its labyrinthine depths. The Harlequins use its most secret passages to move unseen across the galaxy, carrying out the inscrutable will of their laughing god. Even the Emperor of Mankind attempted to access and exploit the webway through the device known as the Golden Throne, though that project ended in catastrophe when Magnus the Red's psychic warning shattered the carefully constructed wards and allowed demons to flood into the human-built sections of the network. The species the Old Ones created continue to shape the galaxy, carrying in their genes the legacy of their creator's genius and desperation. The Aeldari, diminished but still potent, fight for the survival of their species against the curse of Slaanesh. The Orcs fight everyone, for any reason or no reason, because fighting is what they were made to do, and they have long since forgotten any other purpose. The Jokairo tinker with technology they understand instinctively, but cannot explain. The Hrud move through the galaxy in their mysterious migrations, carrying within their mythology the memory of a being called Ka, an entity that some scholars have tentatively identified as a surviving Old One who promised to return when the time was right. And the warp, the dimension that the Old Ones once mastered and that their creation's existence helped to corrupt, has become the defining feature of the galaxy's metaphysical landscape. The Chaos Gods, those vast and terrible entities of malice and power, grew from the seeds planted during the war in heaven, when the psychic emissions of billions of warring beings first began to warp the once placid Imperium into a realm of nightmares. They are, in a sense, the grandchildren of the Old One's mistake, entities that exist because the Old Ones created psychically powerful species whose emotional energy changed the warp forever. There are even hints, scattered through the lore like fragments of a shattered mosaic, that the Old Ones may not be entirely gone. The Xenology texts describe the Old Ones as old gods who fought a war in heaven and hell against star devils, and recount that one Old One survived the war by hiding in the warp, continuing to experiment and create in secret. This survivor allegedly persisted until the birth of Slaanesh, at which point the newborn Chaos God destroyed it, shattering it into millions of pieces that were scattered into the void. These fragments, according to the account, became the mysterious entities known as the Umbra, shadow creatures that exist in the liminal space between the material universe and the Immaterium. The Hrud's mythology speaks of Ka, a deity figure who is described in terms that could apply to a surviving Old One. Ka is said to have promised the Hrud that it would return from hiding when its people united against the Satan once more. Whether this is genuine memory of a surviving Old One, or merely the mythologized, wishful thinking of a species that lost its protectors 60 million years ago, is impossible to determine from the available evidence. And there are ruins. On backwater worlds across the galaxy, beneath layers of sediment that predate the evolution of most intelligent species by tens of millions of years, there are structures that bear the unmistakable marks of the Old One's architectural style. Carvings that depict beings at once reptilian and divine, devices whose purpose cannot be determined because the principles upon which they operate are completely alien to any surviving technology. Webway gates sealed shut by psychic wards so powerful that even the Aeldari cannot open them, suggesting that the Old Ones locked these portals behind them when they left, and did not intend for anyone to follow. The Necron codexes even suggest that the Citan, despite the destruction of the Old One's civilization, continue to actively seek out any possible descendants or remnants of their ancient enemies, as if the hatred that drove the war in heaven has survived the shattering of the star gods themselves and persists in the fragmented consciousness of every Satan shard. So what destroyed the Old Ones? The honest answer, the complete answer, is that the question itself is too simple for the reality it describes. The Old Ones were not destroyed by a single enemy or a single event. They were destroyed by a cascading series of catastrophes, each one flowing from the one before it, each one making the next inevitable, the whole sequence playing out across millennia with the relentless, unstoppable momentum of a rock slide that begins with a single stone shifting on a mountainside. The Necrontyre's jealousy lit the spark. The Satan's hunger fanned it into a blaze. The Necron's soulless legions carried the fire to every corner of the galaxy. The Old One's desperate creation of psychically powerful species changed the warp. The changed warp spawned the enslavers. The enslavers used the Old One's own creations as weapons against them. And all of it happened because the Old Ones, for all their ancient wisdom, could not foresee every consequence of their actions in a universe too complex for any single intelligence, however vast, to fully comprehend. There is a lesson in this story. If you are the kind of person who looks for lessons in the catastrophes of the ancient past, it is not a comfortable lesson. It offers no easy answers and no reassuring platitudes about the inevitable triumph of good over evil. The lesson of the Old Ones is this: power, even when wielded with the best of intentions, always carries consequences that extend beyond the grasp of those who wield it. Wisdom, even the deepest and most patient wisdom, has limits that only become apparent when those limits are exceeded. And the universe, the vast and ancient and fundamentally indifferent universe in which we all exist, does not arrange itself for the convenience of its inhabitants, no matter how powerful or how wise they might be. The Old Ones mastered the warp, and the warp consumed them. They created life, and that life changed the very dimension they depended upon. They built a civilization that endured for millions of years, and the instruments of that civilization's defense became the instruments of its destruction. They were, by any measure that matters, the most capable and the most benevolent species that the galaxy has ever produced. And they were not enough. The galaxy broke them, as it breaks everything eventually, grinding even the mightiest civilizations to dust beneath the relentless weight of time and change and the unpredictable consequences of existence in a universe that neither rewards virtue nor punishes vice, but simply continues, indifferent and eternal. But even in that darkness, even in the midst of the most thorough and devastating destruction the galaxy has ever witnessed, something survived. Oh, the species the Old Ones created are still here. The Aeldari still walk the webway. The Orcs still fight beneath alien stars. The Jokaero still tinker with their incomprehensible devices. And humanity, that minor project that the Old Ones set in motion and then abandoned, that overlooked species of hairless primates clinging to a single world in an unremarkable corner of the galaxy, has risen to become the dominant power in the Milky Way, building an empire that, for all its cruelty and ignorance and fanaticism, represents something that the Old Ones would have recognized and perhaps even approved of. Life, stubbornly refusing to give up, clawing its way forward through the darkness, building and fighting and dreaming in defiance of a universe that seems determined to grind it into nothing. The Old Ones are gone. Their ruins are silent. It wove across a million worlds. It endures, wove across a million worlds. It endures. Battered, broken, overgrown with thorns and poisoned by 60 million years of war, but alive, still growing, still reaching toward the light. Perhaps that is the Old One's true legacy. Not the webway, not the warrior races, not the corrupted warp or the sleeping Necrons or the shattered Satan, but the sheer, stubborn, inexplicable persistence of life in a universe that seems designed to extinguish it. The Old Ones planted seeds across the galaxy, and those seeds have grown into a forest that refuses to die, no matter how many fires sweep through it. And as long as that forest stands, as long as living beings continue to draw breath and dream and fight for something better, the Old Ones' work is not entirely lost. It is a cold comfort, perhaps. But in the grim darkness of the far future, cold comfort is often the only kind available. And sometimes, on the darkest nights, when the stars themselves seem to flicker with exhaustion and the void between them feels closer and more hungry than it should, cold comfort is enough. The Old Ones taught the galaxy something that the galaxy has never quite managed to forget, no matter how much suffering has been piled on top of the lesson since. They taught it that life matters, that consciousness is precious, that the cold silence of empty space is not the natural state of the universe, but an aberration, and a silence waiting to be filled with the sounds of thinking minds and beating hearts, and all the countless small miracles that occur every moment in the lives of beings who are aware that they are alive. 60 million years later, the galaxy is still noisy, still messy, still filled with the sounds of beings living and dying, and fighting and loving and building and destroying. Still, in other words, alive. And somewhere, in whatever realm or dimension the last of the Old Ones may have fled to, in whatever form their ancient consciousness may have taken after the fall of everything they built, perhaps they can hear it. Perhaps they know that the garden endures, even if the gardeners are gone. Perhaps that knowledge brings them something like peace. Or perhaps not. Perhaps the universe is exactly as indifferent as it appears. Perhaps there are no Old Ones listening in the dark, no ancient spirits taking comfort in the persistence of their legacy. Perhaps the only meaning in this story is the meaning we choose to find in it ourselves. But either way, the garden grows. And in the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war and the laughter of thirsting gods, that might be the most important thing of all. Thank you so much for listening to this deep exploration of one of the most ancient and consequential chapters in galactic history. If this journey through 60 million years of lore resonated with you, if you found yourself drawn into the tragedy of the Old Ones and the cascading catastrophe that destroyed them, I would really appreciate it if you could take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. And every subscription helps this channel grow and allows me to keep creating these kinds of deep, immersive lore explorations for you. Drop a comment below and let me know what you think. Was the destruction of the Old Ones inevitable? Could they have made different choices? Is there any chance that some of them survived, lurking in the spaces between dimensions, waiting for the moment to return? And what topic should we explore next? I read every comment, and your suggestions genuinely shape the direction of this channel. Until next time, take care of yourselves, find a comfortable spot, breathe, and remember, even in the darkest corners of the far future, in a galaxy that seems bent on its own destruction, the seeds the Old Ones planted 60 million years ago are still growing, and perhaps it's in some hidden corner of the warp where reality bends in ways that even the chaos gods cannot perceive. The spirit of the Old Ones endures, not as a civilization, not as a power, but as an idea. The idea that life is worth creating, worth nurturing, worth fighting for, even when the odds are impossible and the cost is everything. That idea is their monument. That idea is their gift. And as long as any living being in the galaxy holds that idea in their heart, the Old Ones have not entirely perished. Good night. The Necron revolt against the Citan deserves its own careful examination, because it is one of the great ironies of galactic history that the beings who had destroyed the Old Ones would immediately turn on the very gods who had given them the power to do so. Sarek, the Silent King, the Ha, had watched the entire course of the war with the cold, clear-eyed calculation that his new mechanical existence afforded him. He had seen the Citan gorge themselves on the life energy of billions. He had seen his own people reduced to soulless automata, their consciousness scraped away to feed the hunger of beings that viewed the Necrontyr as nothing more than particularly flavorful cattle. And he had made a decision, long before the war against the Old Ones was won, that the Satan would pay for what they had done. But Sarek was patient. Patient in a way that only a being without biological urges, without the tick of a mortality clock counting down in the back of its mind, can truly be. He waited while the war raged. He waited while the Old Ones fell. He waited while the Enslaver Plague consumed what remained of intelligent life in the galaxy. And only when the Satan were gorged and complacent, drunk on victory and weakened by the internal conflicts that had reduced their numbers from dozens to 4, did he strike. The weapons the Necrons turned against their former masters were technologies of staggering, almost incomprehensible power. They had been developed during the war, ostensibly for use against the Old Ones, but Sarek had ensured that their capabilities were sufficient to harm even the Satan themselves. These were weapons that focused the fundamental energies of the universe into beams of concentrated destruction, devices that could unmake the molecular bonds holding matter together, as that could disrupt the electromagnetic patterns that constituted a Satan's consciousness even within its necrodermis shell. The revolt was swift, brutal, and devastatingly effective. The Satan, caught off guard by the uprising of servants they had long since ceased to regard as a threat, were overwhelmed. They could not be killed, not in the conventional sense, because beings of their nature do not truly die. But they could be shattered, broken apart into fragments that were individually too small and too weak to resist containment. And this is precisely what the Necrons did, smashing the star gods into hundreds of Satan shards and imprisoning each shard within an arcane device called a tesseract labyrinth, a prison of compressed space-time from which no amount of power could effect an escape. There was one exception. The Satan, known as Landugor, the Flayer, was not merely shattered, but completely obliterated, its essence scattered so thoroughly that it could never be reconstituted. But even in death, the Flayer had the last laugh. Its dying curse infected a portion of the Necron species with the Flayer virus, a psychological contagion that drives its victims to wear the skins and flesh of other beings in a grotesque parody of the organic bodies they lost during biotransference. To this day, Necron-flayed ones haunt the galaxy, driven mad by their cursed existence, a living reminder of the price of dealing with gods. With the Satan shattered and imprisoned, Sarek looked out over the galaxy he had helped to conquer and saw nothing worth ruling. The Enslaver Plague had consumed almost all sentient life. The worlds that had once teemed with the Old Ones' carefully cultivated species were barren and silent, their populations either dead, enslaved, or devolved beyond recognition. The warp was a churning nightmare, its corruption irreversible, its predatory entities growing stronger with every passing year. And the Necrons themselves were a shadow of the proud species they had once been, their souls gone, their individuality stripped away, their capacity for joy or wonder or any of the other qualities that had once made the Necrontyr, for all their suffering, a living people. Sarek made a decision that speaks to a depth of feeling that the biotransference process should, theoretically, have rendered him incapable of experiencing. He chose to retreat. He ordered the Necrons to withdraw to their tomb worlds and enter a state of dormancy, or the Great Sleep, that would last for 60 million years. During that time, the Enslaver Plague would burn itself out, life would repopulate the galaxy, and conditions would eventually become suitable for the Necrons to re-emerge and reclaim their dominion. And then he did something even more remarkable. He destroyed the command protocols that bound the Necrons to his will, the very systems that had given him absolute authority over every Necron in existence. He gave his people their freedom, such as it was, knowing that when they awoke, they would be free to make their own choices, even if those choices included blaming him for the catastrophe he had brought upon them. Then the Silent King departed into the intergalactic void, alone save for his personal retinue, seeking penance for the doom he had visited upon his people. And for 60 million years, he wandered the darkness between galaxies, carrying the weight of an entire species suffering on shoulders that no longer felt the physical sensation of weight, but somehow bore it nonetheless. The Enslaver Plague, without the vast populations of psychically gifted beings it needed to sustain itself, gradually burned itself out. The process took millennia, perhaps millions of years, and during that time, the galaxy was reduced to a state of biological desolation that is difficult to overstate. Entire star systems that had once been home to thriving civilizations were reduced to lifeless husks, their worlds stripped of every trace of sentient life. The webway, partially destroyed and partially sealed off by the Old One's own desperate countermeasures, drifted in the Imperium like the skeleton of some vast, extinct creature, its tunnels empty, its gates sealed, its purpose forgotten. But life is stubborn. Life finds a way, and across the galaxy, in hidden corners and sheltered niches, and places where the Enslaver Plague had not quite reached, the seeds that the Old Ones had planted continued to grow. The Aeldari survived. How they managed this is one of the great unanswered questions of ancient galactic history. They were a species designed to have an intensely powerful connection to the warp, which should have made them prime targets for the enslavers. And yet, they endured, persisting through the plague and emerging on the other side as the dominant species in the galaxy. Some theories suggest that their psychic discipline, even in its relatively undeveloped state during the War in Heaven, was sufficient to resist enslaver domination. Others propose that the Old Ones may have implemented specific psychic defenses in the Aeldari genome, countermeasures designed to protect against exactly this kind of warp-based parasitism. Whatever the reason, the Aeldari not only survived, but thrived, eventually building an interstellar empire that rivaled the Old One's own in scope and sophistication. They inherited the webway, or what remained of it, and over the course of millions of years, they repaired, expanded, and perfected the network, using technologies they had learned from the Old Ones during the war, and developing new ones of their own. The webway that exists in the 41st Millennium is as much an Aeldari creation as an Old One's one, a collaborative work spanning millions of years and two civilizations connected by a relationship that was part parent-child, part teacher-student, and part something altogether more profound. The Krork survived as well, though their story took a very different trajectory. Without the Old Ones to guide their development, the Krork gradually devolved over the course of millions of years, losing the sophisticated intelligence and coordinated military capability that had made them such effective warriors during the War in Heaven. Their technology degraded, their tactics simplified, their already crude social structures became even cruder. The towering, 12-meter specimens that had once fought alongside the Aeldari gave way to smaller, less organized, less intellectually capable beings that retained the Krork's love of combat and their spore-based reproduction, but had lost most of the refinements that the Old Ones had built into their design. And these devolved descendants of the Krork are what we now know as the Orcs. And in a sense, they are the Old Ones' most successful creation, because despite everything, despite the loss of their creators, the degradation of their genetic programming, and 60 million years of unsupervised existence in a galaxy that is actively hostile to everything that lives within it, the Orcs have not only survived, but become arguably the most numerous species in the entire Milky Way. They have spread to every corner of the galaxy, adapting to every environment, fighting everything they encounter with a cheerful, inexhaustible enthusiasm that speaks to the fundamental robustness of the Old One's original design. Other survivors of the War in Heaven include the Jokairo, those curious simian-like creatures with their instinctive mechanical genius, who continue to wander the galaxy as solitary tinkers and technology savants. The Hrood, a mysterious and little understood species that exists partially out of phase with normal space-time, and whose mythology preserves some of the most detailed surviving references to the Old Ones, and possibly the Leia and the Slan and other species whose connections to the Old Ones are hinted at in fragments of lore so ancient and so corrupted by the passage of time that they barely qualify as historical records at all. And then there are the theories, the whispers and speculations that circulate among those scholars who have access to the most restricted and most ancient archives in the galaxy. Theories about whether the Old Ones truly went extinct or merely withdrew to some place beyond the reach of their enemies. While the Hrud preserve a myth about a being called Ka, a figure of immense power and ancient origin, who is said to have survived the war in heaven by hiding in the warp itself, watching and waiting for the moment when conditions would be right for a return. Some scholars have tentatively identified Ka as a surviving Old One, the last of a species that chose concealment over extinction. The similarities between the descriptions of Ka in Hrud mythology and what we know of the Old One's capabilities are suggestive, though far from conclusive. The controversial xenological text, known simply as xenology, presents an even more elaborate theory, describing the Old Ones as old gods who fought a war in heaven and hell against star devils, which is clearly a reference to the Satan. According to this account, all of the old gods were killed by the star devils except for one, a single survivor who hid itself away in the warp and continued its ancient practices of creation and experimentation in secret. This survivor supposedly continued to exist for millions of years, hidden and alone, until the birth of Slanesh, the chaos god of excess, whose emergence from the warp during the fall of the Eldari destroyed the last Old One, shattering it into millions of fragments that were scattered into the void. These fragments, according to the text's author, became the mysterious entities known as the Umbra, shadowy creatures that exist at the boundary between the material universe and the warp, and whose nature and origins have puzzled xenobiologists for millennia. Whether any of this is true is impossible to verify, as the events we are discussing occurred so long ago that even the most durable forms of evidence have been degraded beyond reliability. What we can say is that the idea of the Old One's survival, in some form, exercises a powerful hold on the imagination of those who study the ancient history of the galaxy. Perhaps because the alternative, that the oldest and wisest and most creative civilization the galaxy has ever known, simply ceased to exist, snuffed out by the combined force of mechanical legions and psychic parasites, and the unintended consequences of their own best intentions, is too bleak to contemplate, without the comfort of some small hope that something, somewhere, endured. But whether the Old Ones survived or not, their legacy is undeniable. Every intelligent species in the galaxy carries the mark of their influence, directly or indirectly. The Eldari are their children, designed and shaped by Old Ones' hands, carrying in their genes the psychic potential that was supposed to save the galaxy and ended up, through a chain of consequences that no one could have predicted, contributing to its near destruction. The Orcs are their children too, devolved and degraded from their original design, but still carrying the fundamental programming that the Old Ones built into them 60 million years ago. Humanity itself may owe its existence to the Old Ones' intervention. That gentle nudge that set our primate ancestors on the path toward intelligence on a small, unremarkable world that the Old Ones apparently did not consider important enough to fully develop. The webway endures, battered and broken but still functional, a monument to the engineering genius of a civilization that could weave tunnels through the fabric of an alternate dimension and make them last for 60 million years. The warp itself bears the scars of the Old Ones' desperate choices, its corruption a direct consequence of the warrior species they created, and the emotions those species poured into the Imperium during the war in heaven. Even the Chaos Gods, those terrible entities that dominate the warp in the 41st Millennium, can trace their origins, at least in part, to the psychic disturbances caused by the Old Ones' creations during the final, desperate stages of the war. And the Necrons are stirring, Across the galaxy, on 100,000 tomb worlds, the soulless metal warriors that destroyed the old ones are beginning to wake from their 60 million year slumber. Or their memories of the war in heaven are fragmented, degraded by the incomprehensible passage of time. But some of them, the highest-ranking nobles with the most sophisticated neural engrams, still remember. They remember the old ones. They remember the war. They remember the terrible bargain that cost them their souls and gave them immortality in exchange. And now they are awake, and they are angry, and the galaxy is about to discover that the echoes of the war in heaven are not merely historical curiosities, but active, present, immediate threats. The silent King Zarek has returned from his exile in the intergalactic void, driven back to the galaxy by the discovery of the Tyrannid threat. He has seen what the Tyrannids could do. It decided that the time for penance is over. And he has decided that the time for penance is over. The time for action has come. The Necrons must unite, must awaken, must reclaim the galaxy that they conquered 60 million years ago and then abandoned to its fate. And so the wheel turns. The war that began with the Necrontyre's jealousy and the Old One's refusal continues, in new forms and with new players, but driven by the same fundamental forces that have shaped galactic history since the very beginning. Hunger and hatred, creation and destruction, the desperate desire to survive and the terrible price that survival demands. The Old Ones are gone. The species they created, and the enemies the species they created, and the enemies they provoked, all of these continue to drive the events of the 41st millennium, 60 million years after the last Old One drew its final breath. In the end, the story of the Old Ones is not just a story about the past. It is a story about the present and the future and the fundamental nature of a universe in which even the most powerful beings are ultimately subject to forces beyond their control. The Old Ones tried to build a paradise. They succeeded for a while, and then the paradise was destroyed, but not by any single cause, but by the accumulated weight of jealousy and hatred and desperation and unintended consequences, all converging on a single civilization at a single moment in history and crushing it beneath a burden that even 60 million years of wisdom could not bear. There is a lesson in this, if we choose to see it. Perhaps several lessons. About the limits of power, about the dangers of isolation and the refusal to share, about the unintended consequences of even the most well-intentioned actions, about the way that hatred, left to fester and grow, can consume not just the individuals who harbor it, but the entire world around them, and about the stubborn, infuriating, magnificent resilience of life itself, which somehow manages to persist and grow and reach toward the light, even in the aftermath of the worst catastrophes the universe can devise. The Old Ones planted seeds across the galaxy 60 million years ago. Many of those seeds were destroyed. Many more were damaged, twisted, corrupted by the forces that swept through the galaxy in the wake of the war in heaven. But some of them survived. Some of them grew. And in the 41st millennium, the descendants of those seeds, human and Eldari and Orc and 1,000 other species, continue to fight for their survival in a galaxy that often seems determined to destroy them. That is the legacy of the Old Ones. Not perfection, not paradise, but persistence. The stubborn, inexplicable, beautiful insistence of life on continuing to exist, no matter what the universe throws at it. In the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war and the laughter of thirsting gods, that persistence may be the closest thing to hope that anyone will ever find.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.